Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back in time to a world of candlelit corridors, clunky armor, and eyebrow-raising marriage customs to explore what dating was like in medieval times. Picture this. You're standing in a smoky great hall, the rushes on the floor squishing faintly underfoot, music from a squeaky fiddle drifting through the air while you pretend not to glance at the noble across the room who just tripped over their own spurs. Yeah, romance was different back then. Fair warning, you probably won't survive this if you're hoping for candlelit dinners or emotionally available partners. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment with your location and what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge into the world of medieval courtship wearing your best tunic, hand-washed, mostly dry, and only slightly itchy. The social scene is slow and subtle, so no one's expecting a grand entrance. In this world, dating apps are replaced by the vague hope that someone notices you standing near the ale barrels with a suggestive loaf of bread. You're not here for a fling. Back then, dating wasn't about getting to know someone. It was about navigating a social maze filled with watchful eyes, family honor, and the occasional surprise goat. Flirting isn't verbal. It's more interpretive. Think glances that last a beat too long, dropped tokens, not subtle, and hoping no one else notices when your fingers brush during the feast. And yet, love still happens. Slowly, carefully, usually while someone's uncle watches you from across the room, chewing loudly on a turkey leg. There's no, "Hey, what's your sign?" Instead, your opening line might be, "Is your family interested in consolidating farmland near the Western Meadow?" Smooth, right? What counts as romantic varies wildly depending on your social class. If you're a noble, you're dancing under the watchful eye of a dozen aunts. If you're a peasant, your meet-cute probably involves spilling turnips together, while avoiding the pig that's escaped again. One mainstream fact that may surprise you. There wasn't really a dating phase in the modern sense. Among the nobility, marriages were arranged. Among commoners, partnerships formed more organically. But even those involved negotiations between families, not flirtatious walks by the riverbank. Still, people found ways to test the waters. You might sit a little closer at a festival, lend your shawl on a breezy night, or help someone carry firewood home. You'd better believe every interaction was witnessed, whispered about, and carried through the town faster than you could say. She smiled at me. You don't date, you navigate. In this medieval mindset, your value as a romantic prospect includes your family's land, reputation, and the number of pigs you can successfully herd without losing your temper. Your personality, that somewhere below can read Latin, on the attractiveness scale. And yet, people did fall in love, often inconveniently. A baker's daughter and a blacksmith's apprentice catch feelings across flour-dusted counters and forge sparks. They exchange bread crusts with suspiciously heart-shaped bites and hope no one notices they're always at the well at the same time. The fringe tidbit? People sometimes carve their names into tree bark. Yes, even then. Because graffiti and romance go way back. There's a 14th century love note scrawled on a wall in Norwich, England, where someone named Alice is declared. The fairest of them all, complete with some very shaky handwriting. Historians still argue whether young people in the Middle Ages experienced anything like dating as we'd recognize it today. The concept of romantic love as a reason to marry was emerging, but slowly and often only in songs and stories. For most people, practicality trumped passion. But those stories, they mattered. They were whispered under breath, sung to lutes, and carved in secret places. Let's not forget, everything is slower here. There's no electricity, no text messages, just the occasional lute tune from a minstrel who's convinced rhyming eyes with sighs is still original. You're supposed to swoon politely. You mostly just want to eat your roasted onion in peace. Love in this setting is not declared but implied, like when someone offers you the second slice of meat, or you're invited to join a family for dinner. and not as a servant. That's practically a proposal. And you try to keep your tunic neat, your breath tolerable, and your hopes realistic. Maybe she'll smile at you again during the maypole dance. Maybe he'll walk you home past the goose pond and only make one joke about dowries. You might pass a handmade trinket, like a brooch or a bit of ribbon. That's not just a gift. That's code. It says, "Hey, I like you enough to give you something I could have traded for soup." High praise. And while the whole village seems to be watching, you steal moments, quick ones, glances, laughs, hands that linger a second longer than they should. But the pressure, it's immense. You're not just falling in love. You're being measured for what that love will cost, gain, or complicate. It's love with spreadsheets, only written in quill and carried by someone named Cuthbert. Still, you persist, because even in a time of scratchy linens, dubious plumbing, and way too many rules, the human heart insists on acting up. You try, awkwardly, to connect. You fumble your lines. You misread a ribbon signal. But eventually, maybe, it works. You find someone who laughs at your terrible medieval joke. Why did the chicken cross the moat? And suddenly, the itchy tunic doesn't feel so bad. And even though you might be betrothed to someone else next harvest, for this moment, your heart does something dangerous. It flutters. You're trying not to look bored while two middle-aged men argue over your future in the corner. One is your father, and the other is the proud owner of 5 cows, 2 healthy sons, and a particularly promising sheepdog. They're not discussing your favorite color. They're negotiating your marriage, and not in the "do you like him" way, more like, can your families merge fields without drama? In medieval times, your love life isn't yours. It's your family's strategy game. You're the pawn, a well-fed, modestly polite pawn with decent teeth and no known curses. That's enough to get you on the marital radar. Arranged marriages weren't just common, they were expected. Across nearly every class, from nobles to peasants, families took the lead. Romantic agency. That's for troubadours and people in poems. You smile politely and try not to spill your soup while someone assesses whether your posture looks fertile. If you're a daughter, your father is your unofficial dating app, and unfortunately, he only scrolls through profiles that offer property, livestock, or some valuable local alliance. No one's asking how he met your mother, because the answer is probably, she came with a fine collection of barley sacks. Now, if you're a son, it's not much different. Your marriage is also a transaction. You're expected to gain land, a wife who can produce heirs, and maybe an extension to your father's workshop. Love letters are optional. Having working knees and being able to lift a barrel of ale, required. Here's your mainstream historical fact. In medieval Europe, especially among the upper and middle classes, marriages were frequently arranged while the couple was still in childhood. Betrothals could happen as young as 7. The actual marriage might wait until adolescence or adulthood, but the commitment was there, and legally binding. Even among peasants, parents got involved. The idea of 2 young people just choosing each other, possible but risky. If you chose poorly, say someone with bad harvest luck or a suspicious mole, you might doom your family's fortune. Better to trust father's instincts and the local gossip network. Now, for the quirky fringe tidbit. In some regions, a marriage could be arranged using nothing more than a spoken promise and a handshake witnessed by a few folks. No ceremony, no priest. Just, "Yeah, we're married now," followed by communal nodding and some cheese. Later, the church tried to formalize things, but those casual field-side vows still counted in many courts. Historians still argue whether women in rural settings had more say in their matches than their noble counterparts. There's some evidence that peasant women could veto a suitor, especially if he had a reputation for smelling like turnip wine and talking to himself. But it's debated. Freedom varied from village to village and often depended on whether your family really needed that extra oxen. So here you are, politely sipping something lukewarm from a wooden cup, listening to your father boast about your wool-mending skills. Across from you sits your potential future. Someone who hasn't blinked in 2 minutes and just said he's fond of fences. You want to scream or run, but instead you smile, because that's what's expected, even if your suitor's breath smells like salted fish and his conversational skills never stray from how impressive his aunt's cheese wheel is. This isn't unique to you. All across the land, people are nodding through these awkward negotiations. Some feel resigned, others hopeful. A few sneak longing glances towards someone they'll never be allowed to choose. Still, sometimes these arrangements work. You grow to like each other, maybe even love. After all, you both enjoy not starving, and you agree that sheep are unpredictable and slightly evil. It's a start, but if you don't click, tough. The alliance matters more than your feelings. You'll be expected to make it work. Love might come later, or not. Either way, you're sharing a home and figuring out how to split the morning chores. Now imagine, you're from a wealthy, noble family. The stakes are even higher. Your marriage isn't just about land, it's about politics, diplomacy, generational wealth. Your hand might be promised to someone you've never met who lives 3 countries away. Or worse, someone who's very close by and already insufferable at tournaments. Your dowry is measured, your lineage examined, your health discreetly discussed as though you're a prize heifer up for auction. Charming, isn't it? If you're lucky, your family chooses someone reasonable. If not, you could end up paired with someone 30 years older, whose favorite pastime is falconry, and reminding you you're replaceable. And again, you smile. Because you have to. But let's say your father has a soft spot for you. He might ask if you like the match. Maybe he even considers your opinion. It's rare, but it happens. Occasionally, marriages were based on genuine affection, though these were often viewed with suspicion. Love was nice, sure, but reliable wheat production was better. In peasant life, there's slightly more wiggle room. If you're both from modest families with little to offer, but strong backs and good hearts, your parents might give you some say. Still, any match has to be practical. If someone can't contribute to the household economy, they're not dating material. That cute shepherd with the dreamy eyes and no shoes. Off the list. There's also the bride price and dowry exchange. Money or goods often passed hands, either from the bride's family to the groom or vice versa. In some cultures, it's both. Love, a distant priority behind sheep, salt, and who has the nicer cauldron. And then there's the paperwork. Or, more accurately, the parchment. For wealthier families, formal contracts were drawn up, signed by witnesses, and sealed with wax and a suspiciously large feather. Peasants made do with verbal oaths and public declarations. Still, at the heart of it all, you hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, the person your family picked won't be awful. That you'll laugh together one day. Or at least find a way to share chores without passive-aggressive butter churning. Because even when your heart isn't consulted, it still beats. Quietly. Hopefully. Waiting. You stand awkwardly near the edge of the village festival, swaying slightly to the off-key music from a lone piper and a tambourine that's seen better days. This is your moment, your shot at a spark. But instead of a smooth line or a confident step forward, you just drop your mug of mead and hope it somehow counts as charming. Welcome to medieval flirting. It's clumsy, subtle, and heavily dependent on what kind of dirt road you're standing on. Whether you're at a midsummer feast, a church fair, or just pretending to accidentally bump into someone at the communal well for the 3rd day in a row, flirting is less about words and more about implication. You can't just say, "I think you're cute." That's not only forward, it's downright scandalous. Instead, you inch closer during a dance, you linger. When you hand someone bread, you compliment their sturdy goat. And if you're brave, you make a joke. A good one might even earn you a smile. A bad one? You better hope they laugh anyway, or that your exit strategy involves sprinting. Now, here's your mainstream fact for this section. Dancing was one of the few semi-sanctioned ways for unmarried people to interact socially. Group dances at festivals or in manor halls let people flirt in a structured, not too scandalous way. Think of it like speed dating, but with a lot more itchy wool and less eye contact. You take your spot in a long line of villagers, hands poised, feet ready, heart thumping in a way that's probably more anxiety than affection. The dance begins. You twirl one person, then another, then her, or him, or them. You smile. You hold on a second too long. Someone notices. They whisper. Gossip begins. You panic. Welcome to medieval romance. The rules are unspoken but heavy. A hand held too long can spark rumors. A shared cloak in the rain. Basically a public announcement. A glance across the chapel. That lasts a beat too long? May as well start planning the wedding. Or the punishment. Because not all flirtation ends in sweet nothings. Sometimes it ends with a lecture from your priest. Or a disapproving grunt from your father. Still, people are sneaky. A bit of ribbon passed under the feast table. A carved symbol left on someone's doorpost. Even flowers. Yes, people used flowers to flirt. A daisy meant innocence. A rose could mean affection. And a sprig of rue. That was basically medieval ghosting. Quirky tidbit. In parts of medieval Germany, there was a tradition called maying, where a young man would leave a birch branch decorated with ribbons outside a young woman's house as a sign of admiration. If she liked him back, she might leave him a pastry. So yes, flirting was real, and sometimes it involved baked goods. Of course, all of this assumes you're single. If you're already betrothed or married, the flirting game changes dramatically. By which we mean, you don't. Or at least, you don't get caught. Because extramarital flirtation, while wildly common, was risky. Punishments ranged from public shaming to actual physical penalties. If you got caught holding hands with someone else's future spouse, it didn't end with awkward apologies. It ended with village drama that made soap operas look tame. Historians still argue whether flirtation was more common in the lower classes, or if nobility just hid it better behind brocade curtains and tapestries. Some say peasants were freer to follow their hearts because they had less to lose. Others insist the wealthy had more opportunity because of their travels and leisure. Either way, someone was always sneaking glances where they weren't supposed to. And then, of course, there's the troubadours. Oh, the troubadours. These wandering musicians roamed from court to court, singing songs of tragic, passionate love. Forbidden love. Secret love. The kind of love that makes peasants blush and nobles clutch their pearls. They romanticize the idea of courtly love. A noble knight devoted to a lady, usually married, always out of reach. You hear their songs at feasts. You hum them while mucking stalls. And you start to believe, just a little, that maybe someone is watching you from across the hay bales with longing in their eyes and a lute in their hands. The funny thing is, courtly love was rarely consummated. It was all about yearning. In modern terms, it was like crushing hard on someone you'll never text, only with more poetry and fewer vowels. So here you are again, back at the village, green. The piper is playing something vaguely like a jig. You glance over at your crush, who's currently laughing with their cousin. You think. You're not entirely sure. Everyone looks related. You straighten your tunic, wipe your palms on your breeches, and you make your move. You walk over. You trip. You recover. You offer a dried apple slice as a token of admiration. They accept it. Boom. That's practically a medieval engagement. Later, you might see them, again, at church. Maybe they offer you a seat. Maybe they don't. Maybe their older brother glares at you the entire time. Regardless, you keep trying. Because that tiny look they gave you across the choir pews, that was something. Flirting in. The Middle Ages is rarely about words. It's about signals, symbols, proximity, and an enormous amount of patience. And if you're clever or lucky, you eventually end up sitting side by side on a rough bench at the harvest feast, pretending you're just there for the ale, while both of you know exactly what's going on. And that's how medieval hearts begin to beat a little faster, not with grand declarations, but with glances and ribbons and the soft, hopeful shuffle of feet in a badly timed dance. So you flirted, with the subtlety of a goat in church maybe, but somehow it worked. Now you're on the radar, not quite married, not quite single. You've entered the twilight zone of medieval relationships, betrothal. This isn't a casual, we'll see how it goes. Betrothal is legally binding in many parts of medieval Europe. You're basically pre-married. In some cases, breaking a betrothal is harder than getting an annulment, which, considering annulments involved church bureaucracy and several letters written in Latin, is saying something. Let's walk through this delightfully awkward phase. Your families agree, or at least they stop arguing long enough to sign the betrothal documents, assuming your class does that sort of thing. If you're noble, there are witnesses, seals, and a very serious scribe with an impressive feathered quill. If you're a peasant, the local priest might scribble something in the parish record book between baptisms and goat thefts. Or in some cases, everyone just says, yup, they're promised, and that's good enough. You exchange tokens. A ring perhaps, or a belt, a knife, a piece of linen embroidered with your initials and only a slight bloodstain. You're not married yet, but your social circle starts referring to you as promised or spoken for. This phrase has more weight than modern engagement. There's no ring selfie, but there is a goat involved. So who's really winning? Mainstream. Historical fact time. In many regions, especially in England and parts of France, the church recognized hand fasting as a legitimate form of betrothal. A couple would hold hands, sometimes across a church altar, sometimes just in the presence of witnesses, and verbally commit to marry in the future. This promise, made publicly and intentionally, was legally binding. So yes, you could be betrothed by standing next to someone, holding hands awkwardly and saying, "I promise to marry you someday," in front of a bunch of people pretending not to listen too hard. It was sweet. It was terrifying. It was incredibly difficult to undo. Now, here's the fringe tidbit. In Scotland and some Nordic-influenced regions, hand fasting could also double as a trial marriage. 1 year and 1 day to see if things work out. If, at the end of it, both parties agreed it was awful, maybe he snored like a warhorse or she only cooked turnips, they could go their separate ways. Try that with a modern prenup. So what happens after the betrothal? You wait. Maybe a few weeks, maybe years. If you're nobility, you might both be literal children, like years old, and the marriage waits until both parties are of age. If you're peasants, the delay might be because someone needs to build a hut, grow enough grain, or get approval from a cantankerous uncle with control issues. In the meantime, you might be allowed to spend time together. Supervised, of course. Chaperones are the medieval version of pop-up ads, always there when you're just about to have a moment. You take walks, you talk, you share bread, maybe a song or two. You avoid any behavior that would give the village gossip more ammunition. And yes, there are rules about touching. You don't, or you pretend not to. You definitely don't sneak behind the stable. That's how reputations dissolve and weddings get cancelled. Historians still argue whether betrothed couples were allowed, or even expected, to consummate the relationship before the wedding. In some regions, once the promise was made, physical relations were considered acceptable. In others, it was strictly forbidden until the ceremony. It depended on local custom, church rules, and just how nosy the local priest was. So things could get complicated. If you were betrothed and, well, enthusiastic, and then your partner died or broke it off, that could lead to legal issues, property disputes, or a whole lot of "she's not marriageable now" finger wagging. Fun, right? But sometimes you genuinely liked each other. You spent time weaving baskets or walking fields, laughing about the miller's bad haircut. You started to feel things that went beyond duty, like affection or even a cautious love. That made the wait even harder, but also kind of magical. And sometimes the delay made it all unravel. Maybe one of you realized you couldn't stand the other's family, or their opinions on pigs, or you simply fell for someone else, someone who smiled at you a little too long at the harvest festival and shared a honey cake. Scandal. Breaking off a betrothal was serious business. You could be fined, shamed, or even excommunicated if the church felt involved. If land or livestock had already changed hands as part of the agreement, it had to be returned or compensated. That's not just heartbreak. That's financial ruin with extra drama. But when it all went right, when the stars aligned and your sheep stopped dying and the village stopped whispering, then the real preparations began. You were going to get married. Cue the ceremonial nerves and the practical nightmares. You might not get a big white dress or a string quartet, but you will get days, sometimes weeks, of preparation. Food must be gathered, outfits patched, guests invited, rituals prepared, and depending on your class, the whole village might be expected to show up. If you're noble, even more pressure. Your family's reputation rides on this. So here you are, maybe just 16, watching your mother embroider your best tunic, listening to your betrothed argue about where to put the drinking barrels. It's happening. After months or years of being promised, you're finally about to become someone's spouse. But don't get too excited, because first there's the ceremony, and let's just say, it's not quite what you're expecting. The big day arrives. You've washed, twice even. Your best tunic is only slightly itchy, and someone's braided your hair with a sprig of rosemary because apparently that means fidelity. Or it's just what was growing outside the house. Either way, you smell vaguely like a soup pot. Wedding day in medieval times isn't about sweeping gowns or dramatic organ music. It's loud, awkward, and smells faintly of smoke, sweat, and sheep. But hey, it's also one of the most important social events of your life, so you'd better act like you're enjoying it, even if your shoes don't fit. The mainstream historical fact for today: in much of medieval Europe, marriages were often conducted at the church door. That's right, outside. The couple would meet in front of the church, not inside it, where the priest would bless the union in public view. Only after the vows were exchanged would the couple step inside for mass. Because nothing says romance like committing to a lifetime of wedded duty right next to the dung-splattered steps. You stand there, heart racing, surrounded by people who all have opinions about whether your belt is too tight, or if your betrothed's family has enough chickens to make the dowry worthwhile. You try not to fidget. You also try not to look at the cow wandering dangerously close to the ale barrels. Priorities. Now, here's your quirky tidbit. Some ceremonies included the symbolic tying of hands. Yes, literally. This is where the phrase, tying the knot, comes from. A cord or ribbon would be wrapped around your joined hands to represent unity. A sweet idea, unless the priest ties it too tight and cuts off your circulation. Nothing ruins a wedding like purple fingers. You might also have to recite your vows in Latin, depending on your region and the level of the priest's showmanship. If you're lucky, it's short. If you're unlucky, the priest takes it as a personal performance opportunity and delivers a sermon on the sacred nature of holy matrimony, complete with finger-wagging about temptation, and at least one uncomfortable reference to the marital debt. Try not to make eye contact. Once the vows are done and the rings or equivalent token exchanged, you're officially married. There might be a kiss, but more often there's a handshake, a blessing, and a quiet sigh of relief from both parties. And then comes the really chaotic part, the feast. You might be expecting elegance. Don't. Think trenches of bread soaked in gravy, piles of root vegetables, and one slightly aggressive goose that nobody knows who brought. Nobility may have more refined options: venison, sweetmeats, imported wine. But even then, the vibe is less wedding banquet and more rowdy family reunion with medieval karaoke. And yes, people will absolutely sing, loudly, badly, possibly about you. There are entire genres of bawdy medieval songs written for weddings, full of suggestive lyrics, double meanings, and the occasional mention of turnip metaphors that don't quite translate anymore. Guests bring gifts, sometimes practical, like a chicken or a bag of salt. Sometimes weird, like a carved wooden spoon shaped like a rabbit. Occasionally, something actually nice, like a bolt of cloth or a silver comb. You graciously accept all of them, even if you're not sure what to do with the spoon. The new couple might be expected to perform a symbolic act during the feast, like breaking bread together or drinking from the same cup. It's romantic, in theory. In practice, you're both exhausted and accidentally spill mead down your front. Historians still argue whether bedding ceremonies were performed with genuine frequency or if they were more symbolic than anything. In some regions, the newlyweds were escorted to the bedchamber by the whole party, sometimes with singing, sometimes with chanting, sometimes with the uncomfortable presence of a priest who would bless the bed, and in some cases, someone stayed to watch. For legal reasons. Don't worry. Everyone was just as uncomfortable about it as you are now. Of course, many couples found ways to keep things more private. A quick escape, a strategically timed toast, or simply locking the door and pretending not to hear Aunt Margaret yelling about tradition. Once the night winds down and the guests stagger home, full of meat and questionable cider, you and your new spouse are left alone. You share a moment, tentative, real, maybe even sweet, amid the hay-scented air and the muffled snoring of a guest who passed out in your doorway. Congratulations, you're married. The next morning, everything is different. Not in the bird singing, sun-shining sort of way, but in the practical sense. Your names might be entered in the parish records, property might be transferred, household roles may shift, and everyone now expects you to be a fully functioning marital unit, ready to host relatives, manage livestock, and, of course, start making babies. But we'll get to that later. For now, let's pause here. You've stood at the church door. You've made your vows. You've dodged a drunken uncle and maybe even stolen a smile from your new spouse during the goat roasting. You've survived your medieval wedding, which, honestly, is no small feat. Now that you're officially married, and probably still picking bits of barley out of your sleeves, it's time to talk about the thing everyone else is already whispering about, the wedding night. Or as it's known in polite medieval company, the consummation. No pressure, right? You wake up, or maybe you never got much sleep, and suddenly everything has changed. Yesterday, you were someone's child. Today, you're someone's spouse. And everyone, from your nosy cousin to the ale merchant, expects that by sunrise, you've done your part to start a lineage. Let's start with the mainstream historical fact. In medieval Europe, consummating a marriage wasn't just tradition, it was essential for legal recognition. If the marriage wasn't consummated, it could often be annulled. The church was very clear on this point. Physical union made the marriage valid in the eyes of God and man. No pressure or anything. To prove it, sometimes, in noble families especially, consummation was expected to be witnessed, or at least publicly verified. This might involve displaying the bed linens, ideally bloodied, to suggest virginity. Although let's just note how problematic and unreliable that evidence really is. In France and England, particularly among the elite, this custom was taken seriously, because nothing says romance like your in-laws examining the sheets while discussing your technique over porridge. But among commoners, thankfully, things were a little more private. There might be a ritual bedding where neighbours accompanied, the couple to their room with cheerful shouting and ribald jokes. Then everyone left, or passed out in the next room. Either way, you finally had a moment to breathe. Now for your quirky tidbit. In some regions of Scandinavia, the groom had to earn the right to enter the bedchamber by performing tasks or answering riddles posed by the bride's friends. Imagine solving a riddle about goats while you're wedding. Night hangs in the balance. What has 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs at noon, and a very confused husband by nightfall? Your move, champ. So you close the door, maybe bolted, maybe not, and now you're alone, with someone who might still be a stranger, or might be your longtime sweetheart, or maybe someone you just learned has webbed toes. The mood? Could be awkward, could be sweet, could be, well, let's just get this over with so Aunt Hilda stops staring. This first night isn't just about sex, it's about adjusting to your new reality. You're now expected to build a household, manage a home, and, eventually, populate it. And in the medieval mind, consummation wasn't just biological, it was spiritual, a sacred union, a covenant of flesh, and a great excuse for nosy neighbours to gossip about how loud the chickens got last night. Historians still argue whether couples were genuinely eager about consummation or terrified of it. It likely varied depending on age, familiarity, and how much pressure their families applied. Some young brides were as young as or 13, though actual consummation was often delayed until the girl was older. In some regions, church officials explicitly advised waiting for physical maturity, though how often that advice was followed is another matter entirely. For older couples, or those who had been betrothed for years, the wedding night might have felt like long-awaited freedom. For others, it was a duty, a necessary, mildly terrifying part of being married. And of course, not all marriages were built on affection. Some were purely political, strategic, loveless. The night might pass in silence, or tension, or snoring depending on how much mead was involved. In some folk traditions, charms and herbs were used to ensure fertility. This could mean everything from placing rosemary under the bed to drinking potions made with nettle root. Some traditions were sweet, like kissing over a loaf of bread for luck, while others were less romantic, like burying animal bones under the marriage bed to scare off evil spirits. Who knew demon fighting was a part of the honeymoon phase? The idea of love on the wedding night was frankly optional. Desired, maybe, but not required. What mattered was unity and proving it, whether that meant sharing a bed, a blanket, or a vow of mutual exhaustion. And yes, people talked. The next day, you'd return to the world with a new title: husband, wife, spouse, partner, and people would ask, did everything go well? Do you like each other? How many babies will you have? You smile, you nod, you maybe lie. But behind closed doors, you and your new partner might begin to form something quiet and enduring, a rhythm, a trust, an inside joke about how the priest tripped over your cousin's dog during the ceremony. Because while the wedding night is full of performance and pressure, the real story starts after it, when the crowd disperses and the chores resume, and the two of you figure out what it means to share a life. One shared mug of cider, one argument, about firewood at a time. You wake the next morning, married, tired, slightly sore, maybe even a little hopeful. There's work to be done, livestock to feed, a home to manage, and possibly a little life starting to take root. But before that, you stretch, you yawn, you look at your new spouse, and maybe, just maybe, you smile. Because the performance is over, and the rest, that's up to you. You're married now. That much is clear from the way your name suddenly gets whispered with more weight, the way your neighbours glance at your belly like it's about to reveal the future, and how your in-laws keep dropping by just to check on things. Translation: they're hunting for baby news. Because in the medieval mind, marriage isn't complete without children. Ideally, a lot of them, preferably sons, definitely fast. So now comes the great expectation, starting a family. Let's begin with the mainstream historical fact. Fertility and childbearing were central to medieval marriage. The church considered reproduction the primary goal of marriage. Love was nice, companionship was sweet, but producing heirs, that's the real win, especially if you're noble, where lineage meant land, power, and those ever-complicated inheritance charts that made even monks sigh. Of course, medieval medicine didn't exactly help your odds. Understanding of reproductive health was, well, let's just say, creative. Doctors believed in humours, hot, cold, wet, dry, and balance was key. If you weren't conceiving, maybe your humours were off, or you ate too many pears, or you walked past a black cat on the wrong day of the lunar cycle. The pressure fell heavily on the woman, naturally. If a couple didn't conceive quickly, people assumed something was wrong with the wife. Never mind that men's fertility was also a huge variable. Medieval science barely acknowledged that. You, dear bride, were expected to produce, and fast. Here comes your quirky tidbit. One popular fertility charm involved wearing a dried weasel tied in a pouch around your neck. Yes, a weasel, specifically a dead one. Because what says ready to be a parent, like accessorizing with small, taxidermied mammals? Bonus points if it was found during a full moon. Now, the environment isn't helping either. You're trying to build a family. In a world of high infant mortality, sporadic harvests and occasional outbreaks of whatever the rats dragged in this time. And yet, people kept trying. Because children weren't just joy bringers, they were economic assets. More kids meant more hands to work the land, more security in your old age, and more chance that someone would light a candle for your soul long after you were gone. Historians still argue whether most marriages were affectionate partnerships or pragmatic arrangements with duty as the central glue. Certainly, many couples grew to care for one another deeply, but others simply focused on survival. You shared a bed, a roof, and the ever-present hope that the next month would bring news of a child on the way. Pregnancy, when it happened, was both celebrated and feared. No ultrasounds, no vitamins, no maternity leave. Just a growing belly, a lot of herbal tea, and a community of women who'd seen it all before. Midwives were the real heroes here, guiding births, managing complications, and whispering old prayers while boiling water over open fires. Birth was a women's affair. Men were typically banished from the room unless something went horribly wrong. The birthing space was often draped with cloth, darkened, and filled with ritual, icons, candles, and maybe a saint's relic tucked beneath the bed. The goal was to create a sacred bubble where life could safely enter the world. Of course, not all pregnancies ended well. Miscarriage, stillbirth, or complications were tragically common. Some women didn't survive childbirth at all. And the grief? It lingered, even if no one talked about it. Even if the next baby came quickly. Even if people said it's God's will in 100 different ways. But when a child did arrive, healthy and screaming and perfect in their scrunched up pinkness, it was a moment of hope, of triumph. The kind of moment that briefly made you forget the world was mostly mud and taxes. The baby would be baptized quickly, sometimes within hours, because infant mortality was so high that the church didn't want to risk an unbaptized soul. And then came the naming, often after a saint, a parent, or whichever relative donated the nicest goat. Children grew up fast. You might be swaddling one today and teaching them to carry water buckets by the time they're 5. By 7 or 8, they could be apprenticed or herding animals. Childhood, as we know it, didn't quite exist. There was affection, yes, but also utility. You weren't just raising children, you were building your labor force. One sticky, barefoot helper at a time. And yes, you'd probably keep trying for more, because children died young. Families with 10 kids might only raise 5. Every birth was a gamble, and every surviving child, a small miracle. You'd nurse if you could, or hire a wet nurse if you were wealthy. Sometimes a neighbor stepped in. Feeding babies was a communal affair, full of weird advice like, don't feed them too soon after seeing a full moon, or sing to the milk, or it will sour. Some believed in protecting infants from evil with charms, tiny iron knives under pillows, saint medals sewn into clothes, or herbs like fennel and rue hung from the cradle. Anything to keep the child safe from spirits, sickness, and occasionally goats. Eventually, if you were lucky and careful and your humours stayed balanced, your home filled with small voices, laughter, crying, footsteps. You learned to recognize each child by their yawn or their sneeze. You gave them chores. You told them stories. You hoped they'd live long enough to one day tell their children about the time you caught a chicken mid-flight during a thunderstorm and still managed to make dinner. You didn't have much, but maybe you had love, or at least comfort. And through the tangle of daily work and silent prayers, you watched your family grow, unsteady and fragile, but real. So you press on, day after day, holding close the hope that your children thrive, your body stays strong, and that weasel amulet really does something useful. You've made it through the wedding, the wedding night, and now you've got a few sticky-fingered, straw-haired little ones dragging turnips through the hearth ash. Congratulations, you're officially a medieval parent, which means now you get to juggle child-rearing, housework, possible plagues, and the odd superstitious neighbour accusing your goat of witchcraft. Parenting in the medieval era wasn't so much a stage of life as it was an ongoing state of survival. No diapers, no strollers, no free time, but plenty of opinions. Let's start with the mainstream historical fact. Medieval parenting was shaped by necessity. Children were expected to help out as soon as they were physically able. In peasant households, even toddlers had tasks: scaring birds from crops, gathering firewood, or chasing after rogue geese. Childhood wasn't a protected bubble. It was training for adulthood. That being said, medieval parents did love their children. Don't let the high child mortality stats fool you into thinking otherwise. While they may have braced themselves for loss, they still grieved deeply when it came. You'd still find lullabies carved into the margins of prayer books, tiny shoes kept long after their owners had outgrown them, and prayers whispered for safety before sleep. But there was also structure, lots of it. Discipline wasn't optional. Obedience was key. Spare the rod and spoil the child, right? That saying has been rattling around since the 13th century. A good medieval parent taught their children to fear God, respect authority, and never spill the ale. And speaking of authority, here's your quirky tidbit. Some medieval child-rearing advice included warnings not to let children sleep too close to animals, especially cats, because people genuinely believed cats could steal a baby's breath. Not metaphorically. Like, literally suck the air out. Try telling that to your toddler's favourite barn cat. So what did a day look like for your medieval child? For younger kids, it was play punctuated by chores. Toys included carved wooden dolls, balls made of pig bladders, and makeshift games involving pebbles or bits of cloth. They played at sword fighting, pretending to be saints, or, in more rowdy cases, small-scale mob justice reenactments. You know, the usual. Historians still argue whether medieval childhood was a distinct phase of life, or just a short pit stop before hard labour. Some scholars suggest children were treated as little adults from the moment they could walk. Others point to art and literature that show tenderness and playfulness. The truth, as usual, probably lies somewhere in between. Around the age of 7, children were often sent off. If you were lucky and rich, it might be to a monastery or a noble household, where they'd serve as pages or junior attendants, learning etiquette, Latin, and how not to spill soup on a bishop. If you were a peasant, your kid might apprentice to a blacksmith, join a relative's farm, or, if they were particularly unfortunate, be handed over to a miller with a suspiciously high turnover. And yet, despite the hard lives, there was laughter, childhood friendships, moments of wonder, candlelit stories about dragons and saints, tucking in at night beside siblings, sharing the warmth of a straw mattress and a hand-me-down blanket. Childhood didn't come with plush animals and gentle lullabies, not always, but it had its own strange sweetness. Mothers, especially, carried the mental load. They nursed, bathed, cooked, soothed, patched up scrapes, and kept the household gods, or saints, happy. Many also worked in the fields or managed market stalls. Multitasking was the default. Rest, that was for feast days. Maybe. Fathers, depending on status, were involved to varying degrees. In wealthier households, they might oversee education, trades, and future prospects. In poorer ones, they worked alongside their kids, ploughing fields, tending livestock, sharing silent meals after long days. Fatherhood was less about emotional openness and more about protection, provision, and passing on your terribly made boots. Of course, if a child misbehaved, and they would, there were consequences. Some minor, like being denied dessert, which was probably just some leftover beans. Others, like getting walloped with a stick, were considered entirely normal. It wasn't cruelty by their standards, it was guidance. Though, admittedly, some adults seemed a little too enthusiastic about the stick part. Religious instruction began early. You'd teach your children the Lord's Prayer, the the 10 Commandments, and the proper fear of eternal damnation. No pressure, little Hugo. Just remember, if you lie, a demon might pinch your toes in your sleep. Sweet dreams. Now let's talk about superstition. Because no medieval parent ever raised a child without a little magical backup. You might sew a charm into your child's clothing, whisper protective phrases over their food, or hang garlic at the windows to keep out evil spirits. Sick child. Must have been the evil eye. Solution. Spit 3 times over their left shoulder and rub a bit of ash behind their ear. Not FDA approved, but oddly comforting. Teething. A real nightmare. And not just for the baby. Some believed the pain of teething came from tiny worms burrowing into the gums. No, seriously. So they'd rub the baby's gums with honey, herbs, or even wine. Desperate times. Especially when your nursery was also the kitchen and occasionally a barn. And yet, through all the muddle of guesswork and goat droppings, you tried your best. You taught your children to look both ways before crossing the pig path. To pray before meals, to avoid eating too many wild berries, especially the shiny ones. You taught them to survive. Because in the end, parenting in the Middle Ages wasn't about crafting perfect little angels. It was about keeping them alive, teaching them enough to carry on, and maybe, just maybe, making sure they knew how to bake something edible before you were too old to chew. So, you tuck them in, on their shared straw mattress, between the hearth and the tools, and you listen to their breathing settle. Tomorrow will bring more chores, more scraped knees, maybe even a local fair. But for now, the house is quiet. Your hands are sore, your back is tired, but your children are safe. And in this world, that's everything. Now that your kids are sprouting up like thistles in spring, it's time to think ahead. Because in the medieval world, no stage of life waits politely. Adolescence, such as it exists, is brief and mostly about preparing for one thing: adult roles. And for many, that means courtship. Again, the circle of awkward social negotiations and goat-based dowries never truly ends. You thought your own marriage arrangement was complicated. Just wait until it's your turn to arrange one. Let's start with the mainstream historical fact. Courtship in the Middle Ages was deeply tied to class and family interests. Among the nobility, it was less about mutual attraction and more like a slow-moving chess match. Strategic alliances were everything. Love could come later. Maybe. For peasants, things were marginally less formal, but still under heavy parental supervision. You didn't just sneak off with the girl who made eyes at you during church unless you wanted the village to discuss your sins for weeks, possibly in front of the priest with pitchforks. Courtship rituals varied by region, but many included flirtatious gestures that now feel a bit grim. Want to show a girl you like her, toss an apple her way, or sing a song outside her window, or, if you're from certain parts of Eastern Europe, stand in a muddy field and whip her playfully with birch twigs. Nothing says, "be mine forever," like seasonal bruising. And now, your quirky tidbit. In some parts of medieval Germany, a suitor might present his beloved with a gift known as a love spoon, literally a wooden spoon, often carved with symbols, hearts, keys, knots, early emojis for "I like you and also, please consider my livestock." But here's the twist. As a parent, you're now on the other side of the matchmaking equation. If you're noble, you're contacting your cousins, scribes, and local lords. If you're a peasant, you're whispering to neighbors at the well. So, your son. Is he strong? Good teeth? Any sheep to his name? Marriageable age varied, but generally girls were married off between and 16, and boys a bit later, depending on when they could support a family. There's some scholarly debate about how consistently these ages were enforced. While church law recommended girls marry around and boys around 16, local customs often dictated otherwise. And yes, many did wait longer, especially in the working classes, where marrying too young meant disaster if you couldn't afford your own loaf of bread. Now comes the awkward dance. If your child's love interest is acceptable, meaning they're the right class, religion, and reasonably odorless, the families meet, sometimes with food, sometimes with priests, sometimes with lawyers holding charters, so confusing you need divine intervention just to pass the footnotes. Historians still argue whether peasants had more personal choice in these matches compared to nobles. It's true that many village marriages were formed by proximity and affection. After all, options were limited. But even among peasants, families often played a strong role, especially when land, tools, or social ties were involved. So even in the simplest of cottages, love often came with fine print. Now, let's say your child is falling for someone completely inappropriate. Maybe a travelling bard, maybe a foreign merchant, maybe the baker's second cousin who still owes you 3 eggs and a broken stool. You might try to intervene, lock them in, bribe them, send them to stay with Aunt Marjorie until they come to their senses. But if that fails, welcome to the world of secret handfastings, runaway marriages, and the medieval version of you can't tell me who to love. Some couples managed to marry in secret and make it official later. Others got caught and faced public penance, sometimes with literal ropes around their necks as they apologized to the community. The shame was real. So was the occasional ducking in cold water if things got truly scandalous. But when matches did work out, and families approved, the courtship might involve long conversations, supervised naturally, small gifts, and shared work. Nothing says romance like repairing a roof together or threshing grain while pretending not to make eye contact. A betrothal might follow, which was often as binding as a marriage. If you broke off a betrothal, you could be sued. Yep, medieval heartbreak came with paperwork, and occasionally livestock compensation. Once betrothed, your child's partner might start spending more time at your home. You'd assess them, quietly, judgmentally. Do they pitch in? Are they respectful? Do they show up with suspiciously good cheese? If so, maybe you start to warm to them. In many places, couples would test the match with a period of supervised cohabitation, or bedding, which could be symbolic or, literal, depending on the time, place, and family involved. This part of medieval love customs remains controversial. Some scholars argue it was rare and frowned upon. Others claim it was more common, particularly in Northern Europe. What's certain is that love and duty were in constant negotiation. Your child might genuinely adore their future spouse, or they might accept their fate with the emotional excitement of a sheep being moved to a slightly nicer pen. But through it all, whether arranged, desired, or diplomatically tolerated, courtship was an essential ritual. A way to tie families together, to plan futures, and to make sure no one ended up alone with a cartload of turnips and no heirs. And eventually, the day would come when your child, once swaddled in wool and nursed with herbal tea, is preparing for their own wedding. You'll watch them exchange glances with their beloved, or at least their socially acceptable partner, and realize that history is nothing if not one long, slow dance of arranged love and inherited tableware. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree, unless it's being thrown at someone's head in a medieval flirtation ritual. So you smooth your tunic, adjust your best apron, and start preparing for another wedding feast. Hope you still have enough spoons. Now that your offspring have paired off, paraded through a proper church ceremony, or at least mumbled some vows in front of a friar with questionable eyesight, it's time to turn your attention to the part of life that's neither romantic nor youthful. Welcome to middle age in medieval times, also known as everything hurts, and there's still no such thing as retirement. You've likely survived plague seasons, field collapses, and at least one deeply regrettable fashion trend involving tights. Now your joints creak, your teeth are either missing or hanging on through sheer stubbornness, and you're considered a village elder, which is code for the person everyone bothers for advice and soup. Let's start with the mainstream. Historical fact. Very few people lived to what we'd now consider old age. Average life expectancy hovered somewhere between and years. But that's misleading. Child mortality skewed the stats. If you made it to 30, there was a solid chance you could keep going into your 50s or even 60s. You just had to dodge war, famine, disease, and the occasional overzealous tax collector. Middle age was a pivot point. You were expected to manage land if you had any, oversee your children's marriages, and play peacemaker in family squabbles. You'd also serve as a witness in local disputes, share your wisdom about crop cycles or goat hoof rot, and maybe mentor an apprentice or two if you were a craftsman. For women, things changed dramatically once childbearing years were behind them. Menopause might not have been understood medically, but it was noticed. You were suddenly wise, which came with a few privileges, like being left alone, finally, but also suspicion. Quirky tidbit here. Older women who lived alone, owned property, or had extensive herb gardens were sometimes viewed as potential witches. That's right. Successfully aging could make you a suspect, can't win. But assuming you avoided accusations of hexing the barley, middle age brought a certain level of comfort, if not physically, then socially. You might be called to mediate disputes, organize feast days, or help the local priest figure out whose cow is trampling the graveyard again. Daily life still demanded hard labor. You didn't get to sit on a bench all day stroking your beard and offering unsolicited wisdom. You were out there, chopping firewood, kneading dough, spinning wool, or repairing whatever your teenage son managed to break this week. There was always something. Historians still argue whether this stage of life came with increased respect or quiet marginalization. In noble households, older individuals might wield serious influence, guiding estate matters or advising younger family members. In poorer communities, it often came down to how useful you remained. A capable, middle-aged peasant might command admiration. A sickly one might become a burden. Medicine, if you can call it that, didn't help much. Remedies for joint pain included things like goose grease, boiled nettles, or warming stones wrapped in cabbage leaves. A doctor, if you were lucky enough to find one, might recommend bloodletting or humor balancing. And if that didn't work? Well, there's always prayer and a mildly cursed amulet. But even amid the bodily betrayals, there were bright spots. Your children, assuming they survived and didn't run off to become monks, might be caring for you now. You might finally have a say in village matters. And if you were very lucky, a grandchild or two might be tumbling around your feet, covered in flour and joyfully ignoring every piece of advice you offer. Spiritual life became more prominent in middle age. You'd start thinking about your soul, your legacy, and whether your name would be read aloud in a monastery after you're gone. You might go on a small pilgrimage, not to Canterbury unless you were ambitious, but maybe to the shrine down the road. Leave a coin, say a prayer, hope your back stops hurting. Also, middle age was the prime time for developing oddly specific hobbies. If you were a craftsman, you might become known for making the best leather belts in the region. If you were a homemaker, you might specialize in pickling things no one else dares pickle. There's always that one person who insists on preserving turnips in fish brine because it keeps the devils out. Social roles shifted too. As a man, you might be invited to join the village moot or sit near the front pew at church, closer to the priest, farther from the children who throw bits of straw at each other during mass. As a woman, you might be trusted to care for the sick, lead prayers, or advise younger women. Your status was quiet, but real. Of course, not all middle-aged folks found peace. Some struggled with the harshness of aging, especially if injuries or illness made work impossible. Begging was a real possibility for those without strong family networks. That's why extended families mattered so much. Mutual survival required cooperation, not independence. Still, there were moments, quiet evenings by the fire, spinning tales about your youth to a skeptical audience of yawning teenagers, feasting days where you got the biggest slice of bread and nobody argued. That, one time your advice actually helped avoid a minor disaster involving a leaky roof and 3 confused pigs. And speaking of pigs, remember that one from back in your parenting days that everyone swore was cursed because it kept opening the gate with its snout? Yeah. You still think about that pig. You admire its spirit. Middle age, in all its grumbly, weathered glory, was less about decline and more about presence. You were here. You'd made it past plagues and heartbreaks. Your hands were rough, your back bent, but your mind, well, it forgot things sometimes, sure. But it carried stories, memories, and an eerie ability to predict rain. So tonight, you settle into your straw mattress, still the same lumpy pile, as ever, and you sigh. The house is quieter now. Your children have their own fires, their own worries, but they still come to you, for advice, for comfort, for pickled turnips, God's help them. You close your eyes, knowing the morning will come, early, with aches and chores, and maybe a visit from that neighbour who insists their bread is cursed. But for now, there's warmth, there's stillness, there's peace in having lived long enough to complain about it. The days begin to shorten, not just in season, but in spirit. Your joints creak more audibly, your pace slows, and that one tooth you'd been nursing with clove oil and blind optimism finally gives out. Welcome to old age in the medieval world, a time not marked by beach retirements and crossword puzzles, but by lingering usefulness, fading strength, and the ever-present smell of porridge. You wake up earlier than everyone else, though you're not quite sure why. Maybe it's the rooster, maybe it's your bladder, or maybe your body just knows it has fewer sunrises left and doesn't want to waste them. Whatever the reason, you rise before dawn, light a tiny fire, and slowly make your way to the wooden stool that has come to understand the shape of your backside better than anyone ever could. Mainstream historical fact. Old age was generally defined not by a number, but by visible signs. Grey hair, a stooped back, weakened eyesight. If you were lucky, or perhaps cursed, you might live into your 60s or even 70s. Monks occasionally made it further, cloistered in calm, fed by others, and relatively safe from hoe-related injuries. But for most, simply reaching elder status was an accomplishment in itself. And what did that earn you? Mixed results. Some older folks were revered for their wisdom, given seats of honor at feasts, or asked to mediate disputes. Others were seen as burdens, especially if they could no longer contribute to physical labor. Aging in the medieval world wasn't always graceful. It was survival, plain and simple. And survival, as you well know by now, can get a little drafty. Scholars still argue whether communities consistently provided for their elderly. Some records show communal care, shared food, and family obligations extending well into old age. Others reveal court cases where children were sued, yes, sued, for neglecting their aging parents. Apparently, forgetting to feed dad had legal consequences even back then. Justice wore wool and held grudges. But let's not be too bleak. There were joys, even now. You might no longer plough fields, but you could still spin tales. Children gathered at your feet. Not because you smelled nice, you didn't, but because your stories had dragons and saints, and that time you claimed to have kicked a Norman in the shin. There's a soft authority that comes with age. When you speak, people tend to listen, or at least stop talking over you for a second. You're allowed to mutter disapproval under your breath during church. You get first pick of the stew meat, assuming there is any, and nobody questions it when. You fall asleep mid-conversation. Honestly, that one's a blessing. You've likely seen more funerals than weddings by now. Friends disappear like fog, taken by illness, war, or just slipping into silence one night and not waking again. You begin to wonder which season will be your last. Will it be a fever in spring? A fall down the stairs next winter? Or just the quiet decision of your body to not try anymore? Here's your quirky tidbit. In some rural parts of medieval Europe, people practiced a tradition called living wakes, where the very elderly were celebrated while still alive with food, music, and stories. Think of it as a farewell party, thrown by your community. And yes, you were the guest of honor, who may or may not be aware it was happening. It was part reverence, part farewell, and entirely medieval. Another small joy? Time. You finally have it. No children tugging your tunic, no feast to prepare, no taxes to calculate while the bailiff breathes down your neck. You can sit by the fire and hum the songs of your youth. the ones with too many verses and questionable rhymes. You might even try to remember your old dances, though your knees protest loudly at the idea. You're no longer expected to be useful, but you find ways to contribute. Maybe you sort herbs. Maybe you teach prayers to the youngest grandchild. Maybe you just sit still, serving as proof that life can be survived if not always enjoyed. And that, in itself, offers hope. You also start thinking more about the afterlife. Heaven is often on your mind, not because of overwhelming piety, but because the alternative options don't sound great. You've donated when you could, said the prayers, kissed the relics, and even did that one awkward pilgrimage to the shrine of St. Wilfrid's big toe. You're hoping the ledger's in your favor. You might start giving away possessions. Your wool cloak to your oldest son, your cooking pot to a daughter, that small wooden cross you carved years ago. You press it into your youngest grandchild's hand one cold morning, muttering something about holding on to faith. They nod solemnly, unaware of the weight it carries. Historians debate whether these end-of-life rituals were personal or just cultural motions. But to you, they feel real. You're preparing for a journey, one you can't pack for, but still, you tidy up. You make peace with your neighbors. You whisper to the chickens. You organize your meager possessions as though it matters. Sometimes you wonder what kind of ancestor you'll be. Will they say your name with pride, with laughter? Or will it fade like so many others, replaced by newer names, shinier legends, and louder lives? But tonight, you're still here. The fire crackles low. Someone left you a small cup of ale, more water than alcohol, but sweet all the same. You sip, slowly. A draft sneaks under the door, and you wrap your shawl tighter. Outside, the moon rises, pale and familiar. Just another night, and yet you feel its weight. You think of the child you once were, of the festivals, the deaths, the quiet joys, the sour bread, the songs, the fleeting warmth of youth. It all plays in your mind, a fuzzy tapestry of days stitched together by memory and loss. And in that moment, you are not just old. You are complete. You have lived through hunger, through hope, through heartbreak, through love, whether arranged, earned, or quietly endured. You lie back on your straw-filled mattress, the familiar creak beneath you sounding almost like a lullaby. Your bones settle, your breath slows. And though your eyes remain open for now, you feel yourself drifting, not just into sleep, but into something softer, something older than time. You've reached the point in life when the world no longer asks you for strength, only presence. Your stories outnumber your teeth, and the people who call you by your first name seem fewer each year. But now, as twilight stretches longer and the embers of daily life cool, something strange happens. People begin to treat you as a relic. Revered, yes. Useful, maybe. But mostly, remembered. Tonight, let's take a slow, quiet step into what medieval folks really believed about life's last chapter and what came after. Because dying wasn't just a personal moment. It was a public event, a community rite. And let's be honest, a little dramatic. Here's the mainstream historical fact. The medieval world was obsessed with death, but not in a grim, hopeless way. Death wasn't an end, it was a crossing. What mattered most wasn't how you died, but how prepared you were, spiritually speaking, that is. So when your time came, and you usually had some idea, thanks to infections, fever, or the fact that you hadn't gotten out of bed for 3 days, your family would gather. A priest would be summoned. The sacraments would be administered. Confession, communion, and extreme unction. A final anointing of your body with holy oils. This was the original version of last rites, and it was a big deal. Think of it as your spiritual send-off, complete with olive oil and mumbled Latin. And here's a quirky tidbit. If you were very devout, or just really dramatic, you might lie down in your own grave, literally. This was called an oblatus mortis, or offering of the dead. You'd be lowered in, say some prayers, and then lifted back out, presumably relieved that the ground was less cozy than expected. Not common, but it happened. More often, You'd die in your own home, surrounded by family and a few nosy neighbors. Someone might read from the Psalms. Someone else would be in the corner making bread because people still had to eat, even while you were dying. The contrast was jarring, but entirely medieval. Historians still argue whether the dying had much agency in the process. Some records suggest a peaceful goodbye, while others show chaos, rushed prayers, missing priests, heirs fighting over inheritance while the body still breathed. Dying could be serene, or it could be an administrative nightmare, much like weddings, but with less bread and more candles. Once your soul was believed to have passed, the real fun began. Your body would be washed, usually by women, wrapped in a winding sheet and laid out in the home. Visitors would come, not just to mourn, but to make sure you were properly dead. Coffins were rare for commoners. You might be carried to the churchyard on a plank or in a reused wooden box that was returned after burial. Very efficient, very medieval. And then came the funeral. A priest would chant the office of the dead, swinging incense over your body. The smell of frankincense, mixed with dirt and damp wool. People would whisper, children would fidget, and someone would inevitably pretend not to cry. Your grave, dug shallow, would be blessed. You'd be lowered in, feet first, facing east. Why east? Because that's where Christ was expected to rise, and you wouldn't want to miss that. In some villages, the bell would toll one time for each year of your life. That's right. If you made it to 74, someone was stuck ringing that church bell times. Hopefully, they liked you. Now, here's something most people forget. Death was not the end of your social responsibilities. Oh no. You still had obligations. You had to have a good soul trajectory. That meant prayers, lots of them. Your family would arrange for masses to be said in your name. If they had money, they'd pay monks to chant for you. A kind of post-mortem spiritual playlist designed to shorten your time in purgatory. Ah yes, purgatory, the medieval holding cell of the soul. You weren't damned, but you weren't clean either. Think of it as a smoky spiritual waiting room where you burned off your lesser sins while hoping someone back home remembered to light a candle in your name. Medieval people feared purgatory almost as much as hell because it was long, painful, and just vague enough to be terrifying. To help out, the living would leave food and coins at your grave, donate to the poor, and in some places, even sponsor soul cakes, small pastries handed out to the needy in exchange for promised prayers. One prayer, one less minute in spiritual detention, or so they hoped. Quieter customs included keeping a candle burning at your resting place for several days, planting flowers, if it was spring, or simply visiting to talk to you. Medieval graveyards weren't gloomy. They were social spaces. Kids played, animals wandered, and sometimes a cow trampled your headstone. Life, after all, didn't pause just because you had. And now, let's shift to legacy. You wouldn't be remembered through paintings or memoirs. You were remembered through story. Quiet ones whispered by hearths. That time you caught a fox with your bare hands. That day you faced down the Baron over a land dispute. That winter you somehow kept your family alive on dried beans and stubbornness. Your name might appear in a church ledger next to a cryptic note. Died of chill. Or expired after long illness. If you were very lucky, you'd be mentioned in someone else's will as beloved mother or faithful servant, or just old John who owed me a hen. Some people even left bequests for their animals. Yes, there are records of medieval folks assigning livestock to relatives with specific instructions. Give the good cow to Alice, but tell her not to milk it on feast days. The line between spiritual concern and practical pettiness was beautifully blurry. So here you are. The body fades, the soul, hopefully, soars, and the village moves on, slowly, quietly, as it always does. But your presence lingers, in tools passed down, stories retold, and in that one prayer whispered by a child who doesn't remember your face, but knows your name. You rest in the earth, facing east, beneath the weight of stone or memory or both. Rain falls, years pass, and still someone visits. Maybe not often, maybe only once in a great while, but someone does. They brush leaves from your marker. They light a candle. They say your name. And in that moment, you live again. Briefly, gently, like a breath caught in winter wind. Even after you've been buried, winding sheet, east-facing, grave, possibly a bell that tolled solemn times, give or take. The medieval village doesn't quite let go of you. You're gone, yes, but not entirely. Your name clings to the air like smoke from a half-dead fire. You become something else now, a memory, a warning, or maybe, just maybe, a ghost. So what happens after afterlife in the medieval imagination? Tonight you drift slowly through the space between reality and belief. Here, even in death, you have a bit of agency left, though it may come in the form of moaning from a ruined abbey wall or appearing in someone's bread oven at midnight. You are folklore now. Let's begin with the mainstream historical fact. Medieval people didn't just believe in ghosts, they fully expected them. Your average peasant could explain with perfect sincerity that their late uncle still showed up on Thursdays to rearrange the chickens. The supernatural wasn't an oddity, it was part of the ecosystem. Ghosts weren't just spooky for the sake of it, they had purpose. Many were souls stuck in purgatory, allowed to briefly return to the living world in order to ask for prayers. You might appear to your daughter at the edge of her dream and croak, "Masses, child. I need masses," before disappearing into a corner of the ceiling. Totally normal behavior. And if your family forgot to pray for you, well, you had options. Medieval ghosts could be persistent. There are records of spectral monks throwing pebbles at windows, or a phantom knight demanding his debts be paid before he'd stop haunting the sheep pasture. Honestly, it was harder to rest in peace when your second cousin Gerald kept forgetting to light your memorial candle. Here's your quirky tidbit. In some areas, it was common to sprinkle salt into a dead person's mouth and stitch it shut, not for sanitary reasons, but to prevent the deceased from rising and complaining, especially if they'd been grumpy in life. Salt was thought to bind the soul and keep it from wandering. The stitch, just good ghost prevention protocol. Historians still argue whether these posthumous appearances were rooted in religious belief or just social anxiety in disguise. Was your aunt's ghost visiting because she was stuck in the afterlife, or because you never gave back her wooden ladle and your guilt had fermented? In truth, the line between sacred and psychological was beautifully blurred. But not all spirits were pitiful. Some were vengeful. There's a lovely little creature from 12th century ghost stories known as the Revenant, a reanimated corpse, driven by unfinished business, usually involving some nasty behavior while alive, like breaking church rules, hoarding grain, or marrying your cousin without the bishop's blessing. Revenants weren't wispy see-through figures. No, these were solid, oozing, and prone to knocking on doors at night, and people had protocols. You dig up the body, lop off its head, maybe burn the bones, and scatter the ashes in a river, just in case. Church officials officially disapproved of all this, but also quietly admitted it often worked. Still, not every ghost was terrifying. Some were helpful, like the white lady type figures, who warned of illness, or the spectre who showed your lost sheep the way home. And if you happened to build a house on the wrong kind of burial ground, well, you'd find out soon enough. The cold spots, the dreams, the door creaking for no reason. Or, more subtle still, the bread never rising properly. In cities, the ghost stories shifted slightly. You hear whispers of entire buildings haunted by plague victims, of grey figures seen near candlelit windows, or silent footsteps trailing someone down cobbled alleys. Monks wrote them down. Chroniclers treated them like legitimate news. Brother Anselm encountered the late abbot in the cloister. He requests 2 more masses and an oat cake. Superstition? Absolutely. But also, comfort. These stories gave structure to grief. They allowed the dead to linger without disappearing. And for the living, they turned loss into narrative, complete with morals, drama, and the occasional flying candlestick Let's not forget dreams. In medieval culture, dreams were prime communication real estate. Your dead spouse might show, up in full color, warning you not to remarry the cooper. "He drinks vinegar," she might mutter, and then vanish into a fog of roses. Entire books were written on interpreting such dreams, often with advice like, "If the dead offer you," bread, decline politely. But perhaps the most touching belief was that the dead could still love the living. Quietly, softly, from a distance. They might nudge open a shutter during a storm to protect a child. They might stand watch by your bed on a fevered night. You wouldn't see them, but you'd feel them, a presence, like the weight of an old wool blanket that's not quite there. Sometimes the living talked back. Villagers were known to leave bits of food at graves or whisper secrets into the earth. Not because they feared the dead, but because they missed them. The boundary between here and there wasn't brick wall. It was more like a thin curtain, occasionally stirring in the wind. Of course, not everyone believed. Some said these stories were just wind, dreams, or a bad eel pie before bedtime. Others warned that if you believed too much, you might start seeing things you couldn't unsee. That's the medieval balance, somewhere between deep belief and cautious eye-rolling. And then there were the pilgrims of the dead. Yes, really. In some regions, it was believed that the souls of the recently dead wandered the countryside for a period, making spiritual pilgrimage to the holy places they couldn't reach while alive. People claimed to hear chanting on empty roads at dusk, to see shadows moving in formation across fields. If you stumbled upon them, you were to stand still, lower your eyes, and whisper a prayer. Or, if you were bold, follow them, to see where your own soul might go someday. You too might still be out there in some form. A breath in the trees, a creak on the floorboards, a comforting thought just before someone falls asleep. The part of you that lingers might be the part someone loved most. Your laugh, your stubbornness, your good stew, so even in death, you live. Not as a shriek or a moan, but as a gentle echo in the places you called home. You're no longer alive, strictly speaking, but don't get too comfortable in that grave. In the medieval mind, dying was just the middle part. Afterlife administration was still very much in progress, and you hadn't even stood trial yet. Tonight, we drift slowly into the cosmic bureaucracy of salvation, the part where celestial paperwork gets sorted, and your eternal real estate is assigned. First up, judgment, the mainstream historical fact. Medieval Christians believed in particular judgment. That moment, your soul is evaluated the instant you die. No waiting room, no appeal process. You die, and boom, your soul is whisked into a divine HR office where an angel and a demon debate your file like slightly passive-aggressive co-workers. If you've lived a virtuous life, given to the poor, confessed your sins, only gossiped lightly, you're probably off to heaven. If not, well, you might get detoured. Straight to hell if you were especially naughty. But for most people, purgatory. The long, soul-scalding, spiritually tedious middle option. Historians still argue whether medieval folks genuinely feared hell more than purgatory. The flames of hell were eternal, sure. But purgatory was described as almost as bad, just with a vague hope of promotion. Some theologians painted purgatory as a kind of divine laundromat, where your soul got tumble-dried in pain until it came, out white as snow. Others leaned more toward flaming detention center. Either way, the pain was believed to be immense, and time was flexible. Centuries could pass, subjectively, a spiritual eternity of almost heaven, but with more weeping. But here's your quirky tidbit. Some wealthy people wrote instructions in their wills to be buried in hair shirts, those itchy, scratchy garments made from goat hair or coarse wool. Why? Because even in death, they wanted to show humility and penance. Nothing says, "Please don't roast me for years," like eternal post-mortem chafing. Your soul, we're told, didn't make this journey alone. Medieval art is full of hauntingly lovely imagery. The psychopomp angel escorting your freshly unbuttoned soul up into the clouds. And right beside you, a little demon, just in case the scales tipped his way. These weren't metaphorical figures. They were visualized vividly, preached about often, and depicted on everything from wall paintings to church doors. Your fate played out like a dramatic courtroom scene, complete with celestial prosecution. And here's a detail that's easy to overlook, but was everywhere: the weighing of the soul. The Archangel Michael, often looking exhausted but determined, holds a scale. Your good deeds in one pan, your bad deeds in the other. Sometimes, a demon tries to tug the heavier side downward with a little claw. Cheating was rampant in the spiritual courtroom. Thankfully, the Virgin Mary was known to sneak in an extra coin or two of mercy if she liked you. So you're judged. You're assigned. Now what? If you were a saint, which, let's be honest, you probably weren't, you might shoot straight up to heaven. No lines, no purgatorial pit stop, just instant beatific vision and eternal bliss. Think gold, light, eternal, song, and, depending on the artist, a harp that looks oddly ergonomic. But for the rest of us, purgatory. And not just a vague, floaty purgatory either. Many believed it had geography. Mountains, caves, even rivers of fire. Sometimes beneath the earth. Sometimes hovering somewhere between worlds. And yes, some thought it smelled faintly of sulfur and stale incense. Theologically complex? Absolutely. Narratively rich? Oh, undeniably. To reduce your time there, your living relatives had some jobs to do. Prayers were essential. Donations even more effective. If your children couldn't afford a proper mass, they might pay for a chantry priest. Someone hired to say regular prayers for your soul. Whole institutions existed for this. Some nobles built chapels just for their post-mortem prayer needs. Luxury purgatory package, if you will. And here's something odd. You could try to prepay, endow a church, fund a monastery, sponsor a stained glass window of St. Lawrence roasting on a grill, perhaps. The idea was simple. You built credit with heaven's accounting department before death. It's like spiritual layaway. Now, over time, things got even more complicated. By the later Middle Ages, indulgences entered the picture. Promises that specific acts, donations, or pilgrimages could shorten your time in purgatory. Theologically dense, yes, but extremely practical. Can't say one, Hail Marys. Fund a new chapel roof instead. But let's back up, because your final journey didn't end at purgatory. Eventually, one great event loomed on the cosmic horizon: Judgment Day. The second coming, the big reset button. Everyone, living, dead, or half sizzling in purgatory, would be raised bodily from their graves for a final universal judgment. Now this was a concept the medieval imagination adored. Picture this: trumpets blasting, graves popping open like soda cans, bones knitting back together. You, climbing out of the ground, blinking at the daylight and wondering why your hair looks so good. Artists depicted souls rising in orderly rows, looking either ecstatic or deeply worried. And in the center, Christ, enthroned in radiance, pointing, either left or right, heaven or hell, boom, final verdict. But here's where it gets weird. Some scholars argue that medieval folks expected to keep their earthly wounds in the afterlife. That your limp, your scars, even your bad teeth might stick around as a kind of soul souvenir. Not painful, just part of your celestial profile. Others argued you'd be perfected, healed, and glow with divine light. Depends on the theologian, and possibly how good your purgatory Yelp reviews were. Once Judgment Day wraps up, the final destinations become permanent. Heaven, as always, is described in dazzlingly vague terms: eternal light, love, music, and God's presence. Time no longer matters. There is no hunger, no aging, and, this part was very important, no sin. You could finally relax without wondering if someone was gossiping about your wheat yield. Hell, meanwhile, was not subtle. Flames, screaming, demons with pokers. But the real terror was disconnection, being cut off forever from divine love. That image haunted people far more than the fire. Eternal loneliness. It was like being ghosted by the cosmos. And then there's the fringe belief, the sort whispered about by monks late at night. that even hell might not be eternal. That maybe, someday, God would call everyone home. A theological long shot, never officially endorsed, but comforting. Just enough of a crack in the door to let in some mercy. So now, your journey is done. You've died, judged, maybe crisped a bit in spiritual flames, maybe floated through golden halls. Maybe you're still wandering a celestial countryside waiting for someone to say a prayer. Whatever your fate, you are no longer part of time. But the world below still remembers you, in flickering candles, whispered names, and the occasional midnight dream. And in that quiet between lives and legends, you still matter. So here you are, thoroughly processed by the cosmic afterlife department, possibly a little singed from purgatory, possibly lounging on a heavenly cloud with the texture of soft-baked bread. You've left the earthly plane behind, but that doesn't mean everyone else has. Tonight, we quietly tiptoe into the world of medieval mourning rituals. How people grieved, remembered, and occasionally panicked about your soul while trying not to spill wine on the altar cloth. First, the historical fact. Mourning in the Middle Ages wasn't just an emotional process, it was a public ritual. People were expected to grieve correctly. You couldn't just disappear from the village and expect folks to nod quietly and move on. No, your death had a social arc. From burial to anniversaries, your absence had a whole script. Step 1, lamentation. Your family might literally wail, yes, like in the movies. Crying loudly wasn't seen as over the top. It was encouraged. Holding it in could make it look like you didn't care if Uncle Godfrey's soul got eaten by demons. Some communities even hired mourners to perform the sorrow properly. If your relatives were stiff upper lip types, someone else would cry on cue. Step 2, the wake. Now, this wasn't just drinks and sad bread. It was the vigil where people stayed up all night with your body. The purpose was partly religious, to pray for your soul, but also practical. You know, just in case you woke up. Spoiler, you didn't. Still, better safe than premature burial. And here's your quirky tidbit. In some parts of medieval Europe, people placed coins or herbs in the mouth of the dead, not for the Greek underworld fare, mind you, but to keep the soul from leaking out. Rosemary, lavender, and even cloves were considered spiritual plug-ins, scenting the transition to the next life and keeping demons at bay. Bonus, your corpse smelled semi-pleasant. After the wake came the funeral procession. Now this could range from a simple donkey-drawn cart to a full display of status. Wealthy folks might commission a cloth-draped bier, led by priests and trailed by townsfolk muttering psalms. Poorer folk had humbler send-offs, but the emotion just as real. And somewhere in the crowd, someone was keeping count of how many. People didn't show up. Those names went into memory, if not the prayer list. At the graveyard, things got intense. Bells were rung, prayers recited, and the body lowered with the precision of people who'd done this a few too many times. If you were lucky, or just really religious, your grave faced east, so you'd rise correctly on Judgment Day. Crosses marked the site. Flowers, not so much. Too expensive. Dirt and stones did the trick. But what about after the burial? This is where medieval mourning got deeply rhythmic. Families were expected to mark your death anniversary with what's called a mind mass, a specific service to pray for your soul. These didn't just happen once. Some were repeated annually for decades. Imagine your great-great-niece dragging herself to church every June 4th because you once gave her mother a chicken. That's devotion. Historians still argue whether these practices were driven more by love or fear. Were people sincerely honoring their lost ones, or just covering their spiritual bases in case the dead got grumpy and haunting prone? Likely, both. The fear of posthumous consequences was very real. You didn't just forget Grandma. You remembered her, in Latin, with incense, at least until the church candles gave out. Tombs played a role too. Noble families could afford elaborate ones, carved effigies of knights in armor, hands folded in eternal prayer, dogs curled faithfully at their feet. These weren't just decorations, they were conversation starters with the divine. Hey, look at Sir Baldwin over there. Clearly he was important. Maybe we should pray extra hard for his soul. More modest graves had wooden markers, often carved with simple crosses or initials. Over time, these weathered away, but the space they occupied, still sacred. Entire cemeteries became multi-generational tapestries of loss and memory. And yes, every now and then someone was buried a little too close to the edge, and an ankle bone would reappear. Hello again, Uncle Ted. And here's something truly human. The obituary rolls. These were long scrolls passed from monastery to monastery, each one listing recent deaths. When it arrived, the monks would stop, read the names, and say prayers. This wasn't local. You might be remembered hundreds of miles away by people who'd never met you. A medieval version of spiritual chainmail, without the threats or bad jokes. Now let's not skip over mourning dress. Widows often wore black or dark grey veils for months, sometimes years. It was a sign of grief, humility, and occasionally warding off unwanted suitors. Sorry, still in mourning, was a very valid medieval way to avoid awkward conversations. Wealthy mourners might even wear special robes embroidered subtly with crosses or tear motifs. Poorer folks just turned their tunics inside out or dusted them with ash. And mourning wasn't always clean-cut. There were politics, inheritance disputes, and, yes, accusations. Sometimes grief turned into gossip. Did you hear why she really cried so hard at the funeral? Guilt. She sold his ox without asking. The funeral became a stage for performance, tension, and the occasional marriage proposal. Nothing like burying your husband to make you re-evaluate the neighbour's cabbage farm. But even beneath all that, there was something deeply tender. The idea that remembering someone helped them, not just you. Praying, mourning, and even visiting the grave wasn't just about processing your own sadness. It was about easing the journey of the departed, as if your love could reach across realms and carry their soul a little closer to the light. One fringe belief worth whispering. Some thought that if a soul remained too long in purgatory, they might start to rot spiritually. The solution? A living relative had to complete a pilgrimage in their name. That's right, you could strap on sandals, walk miles to a holy site, and spiritually unstick your cousin Bernard from his fiery limbo. Dedication. Thy name is medieval guilt. So here you are, gone from the world, but not from memory. Your name still murmured at dusk. Your place still marked by stone or soil. Your soul still rising in the smoke of candles and whispered prayers. And somewhere, someone still dreams of you. Not with fear, but with love. Time stretches out like damp linen on a washing line, and though you've shuffled off the mortal coil, the living still insist on talking about you, especially when they think you're listening. Tonight, you drift through the tangled world of ghosts, hauntings, and post-mortem appearances in the medieval imagination. Because if death was the end, someone forgot to tell the dead. Here's your historical anchor. Belief in ghosts was not only widespread in medieval Europe, it was basically considered normal. People expected the dead to occasionally show up, rattle a few doors, maybe groan a little in the rafters, and then ask for prayers. This wasn't horror movie territory, it was deeply theological. Your afterlife wasn't sealed tight until every last thread of guilt was stitched up and your spiritual laundry folded. And here's the real twist. Most ghosts weren't malevolent. They weren't out to drag you screaming into the forest or rearrange your furniture for dramatic flair. Nope, they were bureaucratic. They needed things. Prayers, confessions, debts paid, or sometimes just someone to listen. It was less boo and more, "Excuse me, would you mind forwarding my tithe to the Abbey of St. Ethelburga?" One quirky detail? Ghosts in medieval. Stories often wore clothes. Not just any clothes, usually what they were buried in. Sometimes even shrouds. So, if you met a ghost wearing a slightly singed woolen tunic and no shoes, you weren't just hallucinating. You were encountering someone whose soul had unfinished business. Maybe literal business. like returning a stolen chicken. Or maybe deeper, like needing you to say 5 Our Fathers and an Ave Maria so they could finally stop hovering awkwardly over the sheep pasture. Historians still argue whether these tales were rooted in sincere spiritual belief or used as cautionary folklore. After all, a good ghost story can keep the kids indoors and remind them to attend Mass. But the consistency of these stories, across time, region, and social class, suggests a deeply shared anxiety about the afterlife being just a bit too porous. Let's talk appearances. Medieval ghosts weren't transparent wisps floating through castle halls. They were often described as pale but solid, corporealish. Some were so lifelike that people didn't realize they were dead until the conversation took a turn. You know, like when they say, "Pray for me, I've been suffering for years in purgatory," and then walk off into the mist. Others were less subtle. One well-known 12th century account from Yorkshire describes a ghost knocking loudly on doors each night until someone demanded to know what it wanted. The ghost said, calmly and probably a little miffed, that he'd stolen something in life and needed restitution and prayer. Once it was done, no more knocks. Quiet resumed, probably to everyone's relief. And the settings for these ghostly events weren't limited to crumbling castles or dark forests. Churches were hotspots, monasteries, even more so. Sometimes ghosts appeared during Mass, right in the middle of the Eucharist, which really put a damper on the liturgical ambience. Other times they showed up at crossroads, old battlefields, or near wells, places already soaked in spiritual tension. Why the spectral persistence? One theory is that medieval people believed in liminality, those thresholds between worlds. Death wasn't a closed door, it was more of a creaky gate that sometimes didn't latch properly. Especially if you hadn't confessed your last sins. Especially if you'd made a promise you didn't keep. Especially if, let's be honest, your funeral was a little rushed. And what could you do about a ghost anyway? Plenty. The go-to remedy was prayer, lots of it. Families might light candles for weeks. Monks might chant psalms late into the night. If that didn't work, you could call in a priest to bless the site, sprinkle holy water, or even conduct an exorcism, though that was usually reserved for the more aggressive spectral types. Here's a fringe detail. Some medieval texts suggest that ghosts had seasonal preferences. More were said to appear in late autumn and winter, particularly near All Souls' Day. Whether that's because of darker evenings or a theological connection to the veil between worlds thinning, well, historians still debate it. But if you ever wandered into a candlelit chapel in November and felt a cold draft, you'd be forgiven for checking behind the altar for Cousin Gerard. Sometimes ghosts came with a warning. A plague, a famine, a coming war. Other times, they were simply stuck. One story from Normandy tells of a ghost who reappeared nightly, only to weep and repeat the same line. I borrowed a cloak. I never returned it. Someone finally located the rightful owner's descendants, offered an apology and a replacement, and voila, the haunting stopped. The ghost just wanted closure, and maybe fashion accountability. Some ghosts weren't seen but heard. Thudding footsteps in abbey halls, whispered names in candlelit corridors, the sound of rustling where no wind blew. These weren't spooky as much as sorrowful, melancholy made audible. The idea was, if the dead cared enough to bother the living, you should care enough to listen. And it wasn't just individuals. Some places were said to be perpetually haunted, like spiritual waiting rooms. Pilgrims sometimes left offerings not just to saints, but to wandering souls. Those too tangled in unresolved business to move on. Coins left in stone crevices, scraps of cloth tied to tree branches, all little tokens of help or mercy. A medieval version of I see you, I remember. Still, not all ghosts were lonely. Some were angry, very angry. The wronged widow, the betrayed knight, the murdered servant. These spirits had a bone to pick, and occasionally threw things to make the point. There are tales of poltergeist-style outbursts long before the word existed. And if they didn't, get the justice they craved. Sometimes they kept haunting entire bloodlines. Medieval generational trauma, with a ghostly soundtrack. You might be wondering, how did people know if a ghost was real? Ah, the classic test. Ask it to say the Lord's Prayer. Ghosts, or demons pretending to be them, reportedly couldn't. Say it all the way through without gagging, vanishing, or setting off church bells. Very practical, though not terribly comforting if you were alone in a field at midnight. So here you are now, still dead, still being talked about. Maybe you've made peace, or maybe you're the kind of ghost who occasionally drops a cold breeze into your niece's attic just to say, still waiting on that candle. But either way, you're not forgotten. In this strange overlap of faith, fear, and love, you continue, not in horror, but in memory, a ripple in time, a whisper in the rafters, a nudge toward prayer, and maybe, just maybe, that's all you needed. You're finally beginning to settle in, or float gently, if that's more your style. But while your ghostly affairs are being handled with candle wax, whispered prayers, and the occasional Latin chant, there's something else still ticking away back on Earth. Your stuff. That's right. Your land, your sheep, your dented cooking pot, and that peculiar hat you never admitted to loving. Tonight, we sink into the sluggish and oddly bureaucratic world of medieval inheritance, where death was only the beginning of the paperwork. Let's start with your grounded historical fact. Inheritance in the medieval world followed strict guidelines, especially under feudal law. Property didn't just evaporate into the mist once you were gone. It had to be handed over, usually to your eldest son. And if you didn't have one, well, things got complicated. Cue family drama with extra incense. The eldest son, your heir, was expected to step right into your muddy boots. Land, title, debts, and duties all rolled over to him like a medieval version of hitting accept all on a cursed document. This system was known as primogeniture, and it wasn't just about tradition, it was about keeping estates intact. Splitting up land meant weaker holdings, and in a world where your neighbor might actually try to invade your vegetable patch, that mattered. But here's the catch. The heir didn't just get everything. Oh no. They had to pay a fee to the lord of the manor. Yes, a kind of medieval death tax called a relief. It was like an admission ticket to your own inheritance. And if the heir was underage, the lord could take over the land temporarily until the child came of age. Spoiler, temporary sometimes lasted longer than puberty. Now for your quirky tidbit. Sometimes the family would put a corpse's hand on the family Bible to confirm the will. Creepy? Slightly? Symbolic? Deeply. The gesture was supposed to ward off disputes. After all, how do you argue with someone whose hand just approved the terms? Historians still argue whether this ritual was widespread or mostly anecdotal, but it reveals something important. Inheritance wasn't just legal, it was sacred. Violating a dead person's wishes wasn't just a crime. It risked inviting divine punishment, or worse, ghosts. And we've already seen how persistent those can be. Now, what if you were a daughter? Inheritance laws weren't as kind. Girls could inherit, sure, but usually only in the absence of brothers, and even then, their control was limited. The land might be held in trust by a male guardian, or transferred directly to her husband upon marriage. Yes, your dowry could include an entire field of barley and a grumpy cow, but control, not so much. That said, some women made it work. Widows had more legal autonomy and could manage estates if their husbands died. Some even became formidable landlords or patrons of churches. Others were pressured into quick remarriage, especially if the land needed a male name on it again. You, dear ghost, might have had the last laugh, but your widow, she had to navigate court, clergy, and cousins, all trying to sniff out a slice of your turf. Then there was the issue of wills, if you were literate and lucky enough to draft one. Writing a will involved not just naming heirs, but specifying who got what. To my son, the plough and oxen. To my daughter, the spinning wheel and silver brooch. To the local priest, 5 shillings and a goose. It sounds neat and tidy until your third cousin shows up claiming you promised him the goose in 1278. And here comes the open debate. Historians still discuss how common it actually was for people, especially peasants, to leave formal wills. Records suggest that many estates were divided based on local custom or oral agreement, not ink and parchment. This led to feuds, long ones, occasionally bloody ones. Some disputes dragged on for generations. You'd think the land was cursed. Sometimes, people even said it was. Nice touch. Let's not forget the church. If you died without an heir, or even just forgot to specify, the local monastery might swoop in to claim your land, especially if you'd ever promised a donation later. In the eyes of the clergy, your death was later. Monks were surprisingly good at paperwork when it involved acquiring farmland or barns. And what about your possessions, the actual objects? These were often divided up quickly. Useful items like tools, livestock, or cloaks were snapped up by family members or sold off to pay debts. Trinkets, rosaries, books, and keepsakes might be passed down, or just quietly disappear. Sometimes literally. There are stories of rings vanishing from corpses during wakes. Ghosts don't have fingers, but they sure notice when their jewelry goes missing. Here's something weirder. There were cases where nobles insisted on being buried with their most valuable items, like swords, rings, or elaborate garments, not for the afterlife but to avoid family squabbles, as if saying, if I can't wear my jeweled belt, no one will. Of course, that didn't stop grave robbers, or occasionally descendants, from digging them up again. Then there were inheritance charters, elaborate documents confirming who got what. Seals were everything. A broken or missing seal could invalidate the whole thing. So yes, your dying act might have been frantically trying to locate your wax stamp while coughing, dramatically. Priorities. Not to be overlooked, serfs had a different system. Technically, they didn't own land. They just worked it. But their homes, tools, and livestock were still passed down. Usually to sons, sometimes to wives or daughters if the lord approved. And approval could be arbitrary. One story tells of a widow who inherited a pig, only for the lord to demand it as her late husband's labour fee. She refused. He took it anyway. The village retaliated by hiding their pigs the next season. Passive-aggressive? Yes. Effective? Questionable. You'd think monks and nuns had it easier, right? No children to squabble over their spoons? True, but even monastic inheritance had rules. A monk's possessions, however humble, often went to the abbey. A favourite writing quill, a particularly soft blanket, into the community pot. Unless, of course, he'd smuggled a little something into his cell. Monks, it turns out, were not above hoarding cheese. So here you are, your soul, hopefully, ascending. Your ghost, probably, quiet, but your earthly goods now scattered, argued over, documented, and maybe even buried with you, just to stop the chaos. Your legacy may live on in scrolls and dirt, but your frying pan? That's now in the neighbour's kitchen, and she's not giving it back. Just when you thought your legacy was settled and your ghostly duties handled, something strange begins to unfold. Your name, yes, your very identity, is whispered not in prayer or complaint, but in stories, and not just factual ones. Tonight, you become legend. We drift now into the murky waters of medieval folklore, where dating, courtship, and love get tangled with magic, miracles, and a few too many talking animals. Let's ground you first. Mainstream history tells us that folklore was more than entertainment in the Middle Ages. It was social glue. Stories were how people made sense of the world, explained the unexplainable, and shared hard-earned wisdom about everything from planting onions to surviving marriage. These tales lived in the communal memory, passed down from fireside to fireside, often changing shape along the way, and love stories. Oh, they were everywhere. But don't expect grand romantic gestures like in modern rom-coms. These tales often mix practical advice with surreal detours. One moment you're watching a knight swear eternal loyalty to his lady. The next, he's turned into a swan because he kissed her on a Sunday. Classic medieval vibes. Now for a quirky one. In many village tales, love potions weren't the dangerous elixirs you might imagine. They were more like odd home brews, often involving herbs, honey, and a suspicious amount of beet juice. A favourite among folk healers? A charm made from a woman's tears mixed with crushed basil. Allegedly irresistible, or at least deeply confusing to the recipient. Historians still argue whether these concoctions were ever taken seriously, or were just comforting rituals. Some scholars suggest they were metaphors for longing. Others think desperate teenagers just really liked mixing weird things in bowls. Either way, the placebo effect probably worked better when your only competition was a goat herder with 3 teeth. Medieval dating folklore wasn't just about how to fall in love. It was often about how not to. Warning tales were common. The maiden who ran off with a charming stranger only to discover he had cloven hooves. The peasant who ignored his mother's advice and married a fairy, then woke up 10 years later in a pond. Moral of the story: listen to your elders, and don't trust anyone who sparkles too much. Animals featured heavily in romantic folklore too. Not in a weird way, more like spiritual matchmakers. If a raven nested near your home, it meant a proposal was on the horizon. If 2 cats fought outside your window, a breakup was coming. Chickens, don't even ask. A rooster crowing 3 times during a dinner date could be interpreted as, this relationship will end with a lawsuit. And let's not forget the festivals. Courtship rituals were built into them, like frosting on a very stale cake. May Day celebrations, for instance, were prime dating territory. Young people gathered to dance, sing, and pretend not to be deeply anxious about who would pick whom for the next round of braiding ribbons. These gatherings were like medieval speed dating, only dustier and with more livestock. Here's another gem. Spinning stories often doubled as dating metaphors. The spindle and distaff represented more than domestic life. It hinted at how tightly fate and love were twisted together. A tangled thread meant romantic trouble ahead. Dropping your spindle. Public embarrassment, yes, but also a sign your future spouse would be clumsy, which was either cute or catastrophic, depending on your priorities. Not all tales were sweet, of course. Some were downright eerie, like the legend of the night husband, a spirit who visited unmarried women in their dreams to propose, and then cursed them if they said no. This story, besides terrifying many teens, may have been a medieval coping mechanism for explaining why people stayed single. It's not you, it's the ghost. But it wasn't all fear and misfortune. Some stories offered hope. One popular folk tale involved 2 lovers separated by a river, unable to cross. They each threw bread into the current every night. One day, the river turned to stone. They walked across and lived happily ever after. The moral? Persistence wins, carbs are magic, and rivers listen more than people think. A fascinating aside, certain colours were believed to affect love luck. Blue symbolised loyalty and good fortune. Green meant infidelity or fairy entanglements. Red was passion, sometimes too much. So if you wore green to the village dance, you might end up ghosted by dawn, or spirited away to the elf kingdom. Either way, dramatic. Now here's a fringe angle. Some folklore connected love and fate so tightly that birth order, star signs, and even the direction of the wind when you met someone all played roles. East wind? Good marriage. West wind? Trouble. South wind? A brief romance followed by livestock illness. North wind? Don't even leave the house. And yet, despite the wild stories, people clung to them, not just out of superstition, but because folklore filled in the gaps that religion or law left behind. The church could preach morality, lords could enforce rules, but it was the old woman by the fire, muttering a rhyme about butter churning and unfaithful boys, who really kept the dating scene alive. Speaking of matchmaking, some villages had unofficial love witches, women known for their uncanny success at predicting who'd pair off next. They'd whisper over apples, read wax strips, or stare at candle flames until they saw initials. These women weren't always trusted, but when things worked out, no one complained. Except maybe the clergyman, whose sermons got suspiciously pointed. At its heart, medieval love folklore was about connection. It reminded people that affection was a wild, weird, wonderful thing, not just duty and dowry, and that maybe, just maybe, if you followed the right signs, mixed the right herbs, or listened to the right story, your own crooked little path to love might lead somewhere surprisingly warm. So, as your name becomes a tale told by neighbors, on long winter nights, maybe as the romantic hero, maybe as the fool who married a toad disguised as a noblewoman, know this: you've entered the lore, not just a page in a ledger, but a whisper on the wind. And that, ghost or not, is its own kind of immortality. You drift from whispered legends to the physical spaces where medieval dating actually took place, the lively, often chaotic public settings. Picture yourself stepping into a village square or a market fair on a spring afternoon, the scent of fresh bread mixing with the sharp tang of livestock, while townsfolk chatter, barter, and eye each other with all the subtlety of hungry wolves, sizing up a meal. This was the medieval version of meeting someone special, complete with the awkward pauses, furtive glances, and sometimes very public rejections we all know too well. Historical fact first: medieval markets and fairs were crucial social hubs where people of all classes could mingle. Unlike the carefully supervised domestic settings, these open-air gatherings offered rare chances for young people to meet beyond family watchful eyes. Whether it was a bustling annual fair or a weekly market day, the air buzzed with possibility and a fair share of gossip. Now, here's a quirky detail. At some fairs, mumming or folk plays were common entertainment. These weren't just random fun. They often contained coded messages about courtship and marriage. Actors disguised as fools or mythical creatures would perform skits that sometimes poked fun at local gossip or teased the romantic aspirations of particular villagers. Imagine watching a clumsy dragon propose to a nervous maiden, and everyone knows who that's about. Awkward. Historians still debate how much these public performances influenced actual social behavior. Were they harmless fun, or subtle social commentary that shaped dating norms? Probably a bit of both, like your modern romantic comedy with a side of judgment. If you were looking for a partner, you might also encounter spinning parties. These were gatherings where young women spun wool while chatting and sometimes flirting. The rhythmic clicking of spindles was the soundtrack to whispered compliments and strategic glances. For those less skilled in words, a well-timed cough or a dropped spindle could send a clear signal. It's like the medieval version of accidentally bumping into someone on a crowded subway, but with more yarn. Now, a little oddity. Some fairs had marriage markets, where widows or unmarried adults could advertise themselves for marriage. Yes, like a medieval matchmaking bazaar. This wasn't considered scandalous but practical, especially in communities that needed to keep their population stable. Imagine a table with your face on a wooden plaque, surrounded by your best spinning, wheel and a pot of honey, hoping someone would make an offer. Not everyone approved, though. The church often frowned upon the more overt matchmaking practices, preferring courtship to be more discreet, but local customs usually won out. This tension between official doctrine and village life was constant and created an undercurrent of playful rebellion. Here's a fascinating aside. Dance was a major part of fairs and celebrations. But dancing wasn't just fun. It was a form of flirtation, negotiation, even a subtle test of compatibility. Couples who could synchronize steps were seen as more harmonious, and awkward moves could be a sign to back off. Dance manuals of the time even suggested moves that hinted at romantic interest or rejection, like a playful elbow jab or a gentle pull away. And then there were the love tokens. At fairs, exchanging small gifts, like ribbons, coins, or carved wooden hearts, was common, but some were less obvious. A sprig of rosemary might mean remembrance. A folded piece of cloth could say, "I'm interested," but discreetly. If you received a token wrapped in a leaf from a rare herb, you might have stumbled upon a secret admirer. The decoding of these gestures was a delicate art. On the flip side, public rejections were equally theatrical. Being refused a dance or having a token returned could spark whispered rumors for weeks. Some unlucky souls became village jokes or cautionary tales. Don't be like Gregory, who tried to court the blacksmith's daughter and ended up chasing chickens. Not exactly a romance to brag about. There's also a practical side to all this. Markets were places to meet people from nearby villages or towns, breaking the monotony of your own hamlet's limited options. Travelling merchants, soldiers on leave, or pilgrims passing through might catch your eye. This could lead to brief romances, arranged marriages, or sometimes lifelong partnerships that crossed several counties. One fringe detail worth noting: some fairs coincided with religious feast days, adding another layer to the social mix. Pilgrims and locals mingled, creating a lively but sometimes volatile environment. There are records of duels breaking out over love disputes sparked at these events. So, if you thought dating drama was a modern invention, think again. Remember the last time you felt nervous meeting someone new? Imagine that, but with the added pressure of your entire village watching, the possibility of a priest giving you the side eye, and the chance your future spouse might be the local miller who's notoriously bad at dancing. And just like today, sometimes all you wanted was a quiet moment away from the crowd. Medieval young lovers often stole away to nearby woods or riversides for secret meetings. These rendezvous were romantic and risky, a balance between longing and the threat of discovery. So whether you're clutching a sprig of rosemary in your hand, nervously waiting for the dance to start, or dodging the village gossip like it's a flying cabbage, remember, medieval dating at the fair was loud, messy, and utterly human. The same hopeful hearts beating in strange costumes, beneath rickety tents, and over muddy fields. You've wandered through the markets and fairs, felt the swirl of dances, smelled the tang of fresh-baked bread, and now it's time to dive into the more private world of medieval courting rituals. Imagine a slow afternoon in a quiet village or a noble's dimly lit chamber, where lovers communicate not with words, but with gestures, gifts, and carefully chosen tokens that say everything and nothing all at once. First, the historical baseline. Medieval courting was less about instant passion and more about careful, often painstaking social negotiation. Public displays of affection were rare, frowned upon by the church and society alike. Instead, courtship was a game of subtle signals, family involvement, and sometimes elaborate rituals designed to test loyalty and intention. One common ritual was the exchange of posies, small bouquets or single flowers carrying symbolic meanings. For instance, rosemary was associated with remembrance and fidelity, violets with modesty and faithfulness, and daisies with innocence. Giving a posy wasn't just a cute gesture, it was loaded with social meaning. Imagine receiving a bunch of violets and trying to decode whether it meant, "I like you," or "please keep your distance." Here's a quirky tidbit. Some lovers wrote posy rings, little bands inscribed with short romantic phrases. They were exchanged like secret passwords. If your crush wore one saying, "Love conquers all," you knew the message was serious. But if it said, "Go away," well, that was a subtle hint to back off. Romantic ghosting, medieval style. Historians still argue how widespread posy rings really were. Some evidence suggests they were mostly popular among the nobility, while common folk preferred simpler tokens. But either way, the idea of coded love messages was very much alive. Gifts, of course, were a huge part of courting. From ribbons to embroidered handkerchiefs, from small carved wooden animals to precious stones, each item was carefully chosen. Gifts demonstrated not only affection, but social status and intention. Imagine a farmer's son nervously presenting a beautifully carved wooden bird to the blacksmith's daughter, hoping it spoke louder than his own shaky voice. One odd practice was the giving of gloves. This wasn't just about keeping your hands warm in a drafty castle. It was a public declaration of affection. Giving gloves signaled you wanted to hold hands someday, which to medieval ears was a very serious proposition. Accepting the gloves was like saying, "I'm open to seeing where this goes." Rejecting them? You just crushed a medieval romance. The church, meanwhile, played a tricky role. Courtship was ideally supposed to happen under the watchful eyes of family and clergy, with proper intentions and blessings. This was less about romance and more about stability and alliances. But the reality was far messier. Secret meetings, whispered promises, and stolen moments were common. The church often turned a blind eye, as long as the lovebirds eventually made it to the altar. A fringe fact for you: in some regions, there were love courts, informal gatherings where community elders would arbitrate disputes over romantic intentions. If someone broke a promise or was caught flirting too publicly, the matter might be settled in front of the village. Sometimes this meant fines, forced marriages, or public apologies. Imagine a town hall meeting but about your dating life. Oof. And let's not forget the importance of poetry and song. Troubadours and minstrels were the medieval equivalent of dating apps, but with lutes. Composing and performing love songs was a way to publicly express feelings while maintaining a layer of decorum. Receiving a song in your honor could boost your social standing and make you the talk of the town, or the target of mockery if the lyrics were less than flattering. You might also encounter courtly love ideals, a complicated dance of admiration from afar, unrequited longing, and chaste devotion. Courtly love was mostly an aristocratic invention, emphasizing idealized, often non-physical affection. It was a way for nobles to flirt safely without upsetting social norms. But in practice, it sometimes led to secret rendezvous behind castle walls. Here's a curious contrast. While courtly love exalted waiting and devotion, many peasants' relationships were more straightforward and practical, often focusing on mutual survival and partnership. Historians debate how much courtly love influenced common folk, but it certainly set a cultural tone for medieval romance. Now, how about the love tokens carried in secret pockets or sewn into clothing? These could be anything from a lock of hair to a small note or charm. Sometimes lovers exchanged love knots, tied ribbons symbolizing their bond. Untying the knot was a metaphor for commitment or separation. It's easy to imagine some very awkward moments when these knots didn't come undone in front of family. Then there was the ritual of calling, where a suitor might visit a young woman's home to declare interest, often under the watchful eyes of her family. This wasn't a casual drop-in. It was a formal affair with rules about timing, duration, and conduct. Overstaying your welcome could damage your chances faster than a spilled cup of mead. In some places, this ritual evolved into courtship by proxy, where friends or family acted as intermediaries, delivering messages and gifts on behalf of the suitor. This could either smooth the process or add layers of misunderstanding. Imagine your best friend accidentally telling your crush you're interested in her father. Yep, that happened. As with any ritual, timing was key. Courtship often stretched over months or even years. Patience was a virtue, sometimes enforced by seasonal work or family obligations. You didn't just declare your love and ride off into the sunset. You paced yourself, navigating a maze of social expectations and subtle signals. And finally, the awkward yet endearing moments. Stolen glances during church services, the nervous passing of a handkerchief at a festival, or the desperate hope that the person across the room noticed your embroidered sleeve. These are the small, universal threads tying you to people centuries ago, proving that while times change, the flutter of first love remains stubbornly the same. You felt the tension in quiet chambers and market squares. Now step with me into the unique world of medieval matchmaking, the organized, often community-driven art of pairing people off. Imagine a room filled with bustling parents, watchful neighbors, and professional matchmakers, all gathered with one goal: ensuring you don't end up alone or with someone utterly unsuitable. This was the serious business of medieval love, often as much about family alliances and property as it was about hearts fluttering. Here's a firm historical fact. Matchmaking in the Middle Ages wasn't just a romantic idea, it was a practical necessity. Marriages were strategic, designed to secure land, wealth, and social standing. Most people didn't date to find the one, but to fulfill social roles. The phrase "love is blind" didn't quite apply when dowries and inheritances were on the line. Now, the quirky detail: matchmakers, often older women known as go-betweens, were the original dating apps, but with a lot more gossip and dramatic flair. They knew who was single, who was wealthy, and who had a temper to avoid. Their job was to negotiate between families, smoothing tensions, and sometimes delivering not-so-subtle hints about who was available or off-limits. Picture a medieval influencer, but with a penchant for cozying up to the local lord. Historians still argue how much influence matchmakers really had. Some suggest they were indispensable mediators, while others see them as mere rumor mills with occasional matchmaking success. Regardless, they were pivotal social figures, often wielding surprising power behind the scenes. Matchmaking wasn't always smooth sailing. There were cases of outright refusals, secret loves, and dramatic last-minute changes. Families might object due to differences in rank, religion, or even bad omens spotted by the local soothsayer. Remember how much superstition flavored everything? A few missed signs or unfortunate dreams could scuttle an entire match. Speaking of dreams, some matchmakers took them seriously, interpreting visions and symbols as messages about prospective matches. If you dreamed of a black dog, it might mean a strong, protective partner. Dreaming of a broken sword could spell heartbreak. Whether these interpretations were genuinely trusted or more playful is a topic of scholarly debate. Matchmaking also had a darker side. Some young people were forced into unions they didn't want, leading to tension and sometimes tragic outcomes. But occasionally, the system worked beautifully, creating stable partnerships that endured. In more rural areas, matchmakers were often part of the village fabric, attending festivals and markets, quietly working their magic while everyone else enjoyed the dancing. They could be seen as the practical counterpoint to the poetic courtly love ideals we talked about earlier. Where troubadours sang of impossible longing, matchmakers negotiated real-life compromises. Gifts exchanged during matchmaking talks were important too. Families might exchange tokens of goodwill, honey, baked goods, or crafted items, to signal sincere intentions. It wasn't just about wooing the individual, but winning over the entire family network. Think of it as medieval PR. Now here's a fringe detail. Some matchmakers practiced love magic, using herbs, charms, or incantations to influence outcomes. Whether this was superstition or early psychological tactics, it added a layer of mystique, and sometimes fear, to the matchmaking process. Matchmaking contracts, especially among nobility, could be detailed documents outlining expectations, dowries, and even conflict resolution measures. This wasn't just love on paper. It was a legally binding agreement with consequences if broken. So, no ghosting allowed. Imagine being the matchmaker, balancing family demands, social expectations, and the secret wishes of the young people involved. It was a delicate dance. One misstep could ruin reputations or alliances. Even with all this, love sometimes surprised everyone. Secret romances blossomed outside the matchmaking system, creating whispered scandals and stirring village drama. Lovers might exchange secret notes, meet under moonlight, or send coded messages through trusted friends. Ultimately, medieval matchmaking was as complex and human as any dating scene today, filled with hope, disappointment, and the occasional happy ending. It was a world where love was both a social contract and a deeply personal journey, often negotiated one step at a time. You leave behind the negotiating tables and whispered matchmaking deals, and now you find yourself peering into the flickering glow of a medieval hearth, because it's time to talk about the early stages of marriage itself. The courtship is over. The match is made. And now, reality sets in. You're married. Or at least your parents and a wandering monk have decided you are. Time to figure out what happily ever after really looks like when your home has no plumbing, your in-laws live next door, and your biggest shared asset is probably a cow. Let's start with the historical fact. Marriages in the Middle Ages were often forged through arrangement and expectation. but they were also deeply influenced by local custom and the unique personalities involved. Even if a couple barely knew each other before saying "I do," which, by the way, could legally be declared in private without a formal ceremony, they still had to learn to live, work, and raise a family together. Now for the quirky bit. There was a thing called bedding ceremonies. No, not what you're thinking. These events were public. Yes, public rituals in which a new couple was led to the bedchamber by family and friends, sometimes even tucked in under the covers, while music played and jokes were made. Think of it as a really uncomfortable group send-off. Some towns even had official bed witnesses. Try explaining that job title on your resume. Historians still debate just how literal these ceremonies were. Some argue they were more symbolic than salacious, intended to confirm the marriage was legitimate and publicly recognized. Others think they occasionally involved more intrusive traditions. Either way, you were definitely not sneaking away for a quiet first night alone. After that, the real work began. Married life was a team effort, especially among peasants. You and your spouse likely shared tasks on a daily basis. Tending livestock, planting crops, raising children, and navigating the unrelenting weather. If you lived in town, maybe you ran a small shop together, or helped manage a craftsman's trade. Love wasn't all poetry and posies anymore. It was hauling water and trying not to argue over stale rye bread. For noble couples, things looked different, but not necessarily easier. Land disputes, political alliances, and social obligations dominated their schedules. A noble woman might be expected to oversee a large household, or even stand in for her husband during his absences. Dowries, titles, and property all tangled together in ways that could bind two people together, or pit them against each other. Here's a weird one. Some communities believed it was unlucky to speak the bride's name for 3 days after the wedding. Why? No one's quite sure. Maybe it was to protect her from spirits or to give her space to adjust. Either way, imagine starting your married life being called "you there" by everyone in your new home. Despite all this structure and supervision, marriages could be surprisingly personal. Letters survive from medieval spouses that speak of fondness, longing, even playful teasing. Some couples clearly liked each other. Others? Well, let's just say there were a lot of disputes, and divorce wasn't exactly easy. Not impossible, though. In rare cases, annulments were granted. Reasons ranged from consanguinity, being too closely related, to impotence, to fraud. Some creative folks even faked their own deaths to escape unhappy unions, which tells you how desperate things could get. And then there was celibacy. Wait, what? Yes, some married couples agreed to live in chaste companionship, often for religious reasons. This was especially popular in later life, or if one partner took a vow. It sounds strange now, but for many, faith trumped flesh. Speaking of vows, marriage customs varied wildly across regions. Some involved formal church ceremonies. Others were as simple as declaring mutual consent in front of witnesses. The church eventually tried to standardize things with official rites and written contracts, but local traditions often endured. Jumping over a broom, sharing bread and ale, or tying hands together with ribbons, each had its own meaning. One fringe belief worth mentioning. In some parts of Europe, it was thought that if a man gave his belt to his bride on their wedding day, it would protect them from infidelity. Imagine handing over your only good leather belt in the hope it keeps your marriage intact. A stylish, if slightly misguided gesture. Daily married life had its highs and lows. There were shared meals, winter evenings by the fire, maybe even laughter echoing off stone walls. But there were also plagues, hunger, and the constant spectre of childbirth, the greatest danger for medieval women. Love had to weather it all. And let's not forget the neighbors. Medieval communities were tight-knit and nosy. Your business was everyone's business. A fight overheard through thin walls could end up as gossip at the market. Keeping a marriage afloat required patience, cooperation, and occasionally a thick skin. Still, for many, marriage offered companionship and emotional support. People grew into their love. They leaned on each other through hardship and celebrated life's small joys. a healthy child, a good harvest, a moment of peace. It was a partnership, sometimes awkward, sometimes warm, and always shaped by the unpredictable rhythm of the world around them. So, now that you're hitched and holding a symbolic belt, lying beside someone you may or may not know very well, listening to the wind creep through wooden shutters, just remember, this is the easy part. There's a whole life ahead, filled with routines and surprises. And whether you fell head over heels or just accepted your fate with a sigh, you're not alone in wondering, what now? You've stepped into the rhythms of married life. Now, let's explore what came next when that life didn't exactly play out like a troubadour's love ballad. Because in medieval times, while "till death do us part" was more of a command than a wish, not all unions made it to the final verse. The church may have frowned on separation, but medieval people still found ways to bend, stretch, and sometimes break the rules of matrimony. Let's start with a steady historical fact. Medieval marriage was considered a sacred sacrament, especially after the 12th century when the church tightened its grip on the rules. Getting married wasn't just a social arrangement anymore. It was a spiritual bond, sealed by vows, and supposedly irreversible. Divorce, in the modern sense, didn't officially exist, but, as you'll see, people were nothing if not inventive. Now, the quirky part, there were loopholes, big ones. For instance, annulments. These weren't technically divorces. They declared that a marriage had never been valid in the first place. Reasons. Oh, there were plenty. Maybe the couple were too closely related. That happened a lot. Maybe they never consummated the union. Tricky to prove. Or maybe one party had already been married. Oops. Sometimes people went full medieval lawyer and claimed they were betrothed to someone else first. It was like pulling a reverse Uno card on your spouse. Historians still argue over how accessible annulments really were. For the rich and powerful, pretty attainable. Kings, for example, had popes on speed dial. But for peasants, getting an annulment meant convincing the local bishop and likely dragging your private business through a very public, very judgmental court. Some more desperate individuals took matters into their own hands. Desertion wasn't uncommon. If a husband left for a distant town and never returned, the wife might eventually remarry, especially if several winters passed with no sign of him, and the neighbors started whispering. In these cases, communities sometimes gave a quiet nod of approval. Life had to go on after all. But what if you didn't want to leave, or couldn't? Enter the concept of separate maintenance. In some regions, couples could legally live apart while still being technically married. The church occasionally allowed this in cases of abuse, neglect, or extreme incompatibility, though proving those things was no small feat. Often, it required local clergy or magistrates to step in, and they weren't exactly trained therapists. Now, here's a strange fringe tidbit. In parts of France and Germany, unhappy spouses could take part in mock divorce rituals. One involved standing on opposite sides of a bridge, turning your backs and walking away, symbolizing a break. It had no legal effect, but in the court of public opinion, it might just do the trick. If nothing else, it gave everyone something to talk about until Lent. Another curious practice was the use of bed dividers. Couples too incompatible, or too fed up, might literally draw a line down the bed using a rope or board. This makeshift separation turned their shared space into two metaphorical bedrooms. Think of it as medieval marriage counseling without the talking part. Infidelity, as always, was a thorny issue. For women, the consequences were far harsher than for men. A wife caught cheating could face public shaming, exile, or worse. A husband, he might get a stern lecture, unless he was consorting with someone of significantly lower class or causing scandal. The double standard was alive and well, usually drinking ale in the village square. Sometimes, though, couples genuinely tried to reconcile. The church often pushed for forgiveness, especially if children were involved. Priests would act as mediators, urging patience and prayer. You might imagine a couple sitting before a weary priest, both avoiding eye contact, while he drones on about mutual humility and the sanctity of marriage. Effective, Debatable, but at least someone was trying. And of course, love could simply fade. Some partners coexisted in a state of quiet detachment. They performed their duties, raised their children, worked side by side without fire or affection. These cold marriages were accepted, even expected in some circles. Passion, after all, wasn't the goal, stability was. Still, people being people, there were plenty of secret affairs, coded letters, and awkward encounters behind haystacks. Entire poems and ballads revolved around unhappy lovers stuck in loveless marriages. And yes, a few did the unthinkable. Ran away, disguised themselves, even faked deaths. Drastic, theatrical, and very medieval. In rare cases, community involvement went a bit too far. Some towns hosted scolds' bridals and ducking stools to punish so-called troublesome wives. If a woman was seen as disrespectful, nagging, or rebellious, she might be paraded through town in a humiliating device. Today, we call that abuse. Back then, it was viewed as discipline, an ugly part of the medieval marital reality. One debate historians still wrestle with: just how much autonomy did women have in leaving a bad marriage? Some documents suggest they petitioned local courts with success, especially in urban centres. Others reveal that options were limited, especially in rural areas. Social class, location, and the temperament of your local clergy all played a part. Yet within all this structure and constraint, there was resilience. Some women became widows and chose not to remarry, enjoying newfound independence. Others stayed married, but carved out their own spheres of influence, managing businesses, leading households, and raising families with strength and clarity. These weren't helpless damsels trapped in towers. They were real people, navigating a tough world with creativity, patience, and the occasional well-timed eye roll. And so, as you curl up under your blanket, may be thankful your own love life doesn't involve public bedding ceremonies or disappearing husbands. Remember, medieval marriage was less a fairy tale and more a very complicated partnership. One with moments of joy, plenty of mess, and, every now and then, a spark that lasted. You've trudged through medieval marriages, the good, the bad, and the eyebrow-raising. Now it's time to ease into what happened next. Legacy, lineage, and the gentle fade into family history. Because once the romantic ballads quieted and the chores were done, the focus often shifted to what all that union had built. Children, property, memories, and maybe, if you were lucky, a story or two that outlived you. Let's open with a steady, historical fact. In medieval society, the primary goal of most marriages, especially among the nobility, was the production of legitimate heirs. This wasn't just a quaint cultural norm, it was a legal and economic necessity. Children meant continuity. Without them, titles could vanish, lands could revert to the crown, and family names could disappear like breath on cold glass. But here's the quirky twist. While sons were typically the desired outcome, for obvious inheritance reasons, daughters had their own crucial role: marriage alliances. A well-married daughter could link families, soothe rivalries, or open trade routes. Some families even gave daughters nicknames like "my little treaty." Charming, right? Now, historians still debate how much say children had in shaping their own futures. Yes, there were arranged marriages. Yes, expectations loomed heavy. But tucked within those constraints were glimpses of choice. Letters survive where sons politely, or not so politely, refused their parents' suggestions. Daughters, especially those with strong-willed mothers, occasionally pushed back too. It wasn't all silent compliance. Child-rearing itself was a full-time endeavor, and one often outsourced. In wealthier households, wet nurses and governesses helped raise children, while peasants simply taught by example. You learned to bake by baking, to plow by plowing, and to survive by watching your elders do the same. Family wasn't just blood, it was labor, routine, shared soup, and the occasional shouting match over chores. Fringe custom time. Some regions believed a child's future could be predicted by how they reached for objects during their first birthday. A coin, a book, or a sword laid before them like a medieval career quiz. Pick the sword. A soldier. The coin? A merchant. Grab the pastry? Definitely a poet, or at least a village snack enthusiast. As children grew, they absorbed the legacy of their parents' union, both the love and the lessons. Some inherited land, others a trade, and a few only stories passed around the hearth. And, like now, those stories mattered. Family histories were shared orally, shaped like soft clay with every retelling. An ancestor's brave moment during a siege. A grandmother who outsmarted tax collectors. A father who danced terribly but always tried. Married couples, particularly in their later years, often found solace in watching their families grow. Grandchildren brought a different kind of joy, less pressure, more giggles. And in old age, roles shifted. Children who had once needed help now provided it. Elders were sometimes revered, sometimes just tolerated, but rarely ignored. Property, of course, always hovered in the background. Wills were important documents, carefully negotiated to avoid family squabbles. Not that it worked. Medieval families bickered over inheritance as energetically as any modern soap opera cast. But for many, the goal was to leave behind something secure, a small field, a loom, a few goats, maybe just a silver brooch with a story attached. Even love was passed on in its own way. Advice, crude or poetic, filtered through generations. Choose someone who can carry a bucket without spilling. It, a grandfather might say. Practical maybe, but it was wisdom earned from years of spilled buckets and spicier arguments. Here's another odd tidbit. Some families created love tokens, tiny carved trinkets or pieces of knotted fabric meant to bring romantic luck to descendants. If you found one in an old chest, you weren't supposed to throw it away. Bad omen. You tucked it into your own drawer and hoped the magic held. By now, you might be thinking, it wasn't about grand passion, was it? Not always. But there was something else. Endurance. A quiet kind of affection that grew over years of shared mornings. Patching clothes by firelight, holding hands during plagues, and watching stars from a creaky wooden porch. The final chapter of many medieval marriages wasn't marked by fanfare, but by presence, sitting together in silence, preparing a simple meal, offering a mug of ale without being asked. Grief came in quiet waves when one partner passed, and sometimes the surviving spouse remarried, not out of betrayal, but out of need, practicality, or the ache of solitude. Tombs tell their own stories. Inscriptions often mention not just names and titles, but sentiments like beloved wife or faithful husband. Some couples were buried hand in hand. Others had effigies side by side, frozen in stone, resting as if mid-conversation. Even in death, their union remained visible, a testament to a life shared, however ordinary or extraordinary. And that's the legacy, really. Not the flashy weddings or the matchmaking drama, not the pageantry or the dowries, but the day-to-day weaving of two lives into one. The struggles, the compromises, the quiet victories, all passed down in hands that knead bread just like their mother did, or eyes that twinkle the same way a grandfather's once did under starlight. As the fire dims and the night deepens, you might find yourself thinking about those long-ago lovers and fighters, the steady builders of homes and families. They lived in a world harsher than ours, yet love, real, raw, imperfect love, still found ways to bloom. And in the end, that's a legacy that even time can't undo. And now, you arrive at the last stretch of this long, winding cobblestone road. Your lantern flickers low, your steps slow, and the medieval world of courtship, marriages, awkward in-laws, and love tokens tucked in sleeves gently fades behind you. Tonight, we're easing into what it all meant, what remains of that messy, charming, layered history of medieval dating. Because while the ballads have ended and the banquet tables have been cleared, there's still something left in the silence. The echo of how people tried to love each other across centuries. Let's anchor ourselves with a final historical fact. Love, marriage, and partnership in the medieval world weren't just private matters. They were social contracts, religious rituals, legal arrangements, and occasionally power moves worthy of a chessboard. From peasants in damp cottages to nobles in echoing stone halls, relationships shaped lives and communities. And you've seen now how deeply that complexity ran. Yet, in true medieval style, even this wasn't straightforward. The line between love and obligation blurred often. Feelings sometimes followed structure. You married someone because your parents said so, and only after the wedding did affection, or, at least, familiarity, grow like ivy along the walls. And sometimes, love came first, defiant and inconvenient, and the world rearranged itself around it, just like it does now. Now, here's your final quirky tidbit. There was a medieval belief that sneezing during a first kiss meant good luck, a sneeze, of all things. Some said it meant you'd have a long life together. Others claimed it was the soul reacting to being bonded. Honestly, probably just allergies and awkward timing, but still, sweet. Historians continue to debate whether true romantic love was a rarity or more common than the formal documents suggest. Letters, poems, and songs hint at deep longing, heartbreak, and joy. But most of what survives are legal records, dowry contracts, court disputes, things written by scribes and monks, not poets or swooning lovers. Still, if you listen between the lines, you'll find whispers of affection. And this is where your journey leaves you, in the gentle space between memory and imagination. You've watched betrothals by candlelight, navigated medieval Tinder scrolls, better known as family alliances, sat through painfully long courtship rituals, survived the judgmental cousin at the feast, and even peeked in on couples managing their fourth trial separation via rope down the middle of the bed. But maybe what stays with you most isn't the rules or customs, or even the scandals. It's the humanness of it all. The young woman pressing a flower into her sleeve and hoping the baker's son notices. The scribe writing a love letter with smudged ink because his hands won't stop shaking. The old couple arguing gently over which soup herbs to use while secretly loving that the other one still cares enough to argue. These weren't perfect people. Their marriages weren't fairy tales. But they tried. They loved the best way they knew how. With limited privacy, no scented candles, and an alarming amount of mead, they made it work in a world with wolves at the edge of the forest and winter always coming too soon. And through it all, they built a world where love, gritty, hopeful, enduring, could exist. And now, wind down, 300 words. Let your shoulders settle. The clatter of hooves is gone, the chatter of feasts has faded, and the last embroidered hem has swayed out of sight. There's only the hush of night now, quiet and unhurried, like soft moss underfoot. Breathe in slowly, as if you're gathering warmth from the last glowing embers of a hearth. Let the rhythm of the past fall away, the courtships and contracts, the matchmaking and murmured vows, and rest here where time no longer matters. Imagine yourself standing at the edge of a still medieval field. The sky above is endless, full of stars that shimmer without rushing. Behind you, the faint echoes of a lute fade into the hush of distant wind. A cool breeze brushes your face, gentle as the memory of someone brushing your hair from your brow. Here, in this moment, there's no urgency, no expectations, just the peace that comes after the story ends. You made it through the awkward love poems and the elaborate rituals. You endured long-winded clerics and overly involved parents. And now, like those who came before, you settle into stillness, safe, whole, and wrapped in the quiet magic of simply having made it to the end. So rest. You've earned it. Tomorrow the world can wait. But tonight, let the past drift gently into dreams. Let the past drift gently into dreams.